Imagine pausing, just for a moment, in the middle of your ordinary day. The messages, the plans, the quiet worries in the background. If you look closely, you might sense a tension running through it all, a constant leaning forward, a never quite enough. Arthur Schopenhauer begins right there, in this felt restlessness of existence. He asks, what is this world we move through, and what are we inside it? For him, everything begins with a simple, radical distinction. There is the world as it appears to us, and the world as it is in itself. The world of tables and trees, of clocks and causes, of this happened, because of that. He calls this the world as representation. It is not a fake world, but a world already shaped by the way we see and think. We never stand outside this seeing. There is always a subject who experiences and an object that appears. Space-time, causality, these are the lenses through which the world comes to us. The stage on which our conscious life unfolds. As you listen, you might notice this stage in your own experience, the sense of I, here looking at that, there. But for Schopenhauer, behind this scene of appearances, there is a deeper reality, one that does not show up as an object among objects. He calls it the will, not the personal will of choosing this or that, but a blind, ceaseless striving that runs through everything, through nature, through your body, through every desire and fear. From this, he draws a stark insight: life is saturated with suffering. Because the will is never finally at rest. When it is thwarted, there is pain. When it is fulfilled, the relief fades, leaving boredom, and a new desire arises. Our days swing between wanting and emptiness, between pressure and dullness. Yet Schopenhauer also traces paths of quiet resistance. In aesthetic contemplation, especially in the presence of profound art or music, the usual push of striving can fall away. For a moment, you are simply seeing, simply listening. The world appears without demand. He also discovers an ethics of compassion. When you glimpse that the same inner reality lives in others, the hard line between me and you softens, and genuine concern for their suffering becomes natural. At the furthest edge lies renunciation, a gradual loosening of the will's grip, a simplification of life, an opening toward a deeper stillness. In this journey, we will move slowly through these layers: appearance and reality, will and suffering, art, compassion and release. As you continue, you might ask yourself, in my own life of constant striving, where do I sense the possibility of a quieter way of being? Part 1. The principle of sufficient reason. Beneath most of our ordinary thoughts, a quiet conviction sits unquestioned: things do not just happen. If a glass shatters on the floor, we look for what knocked it over. If someone changes toward us, we ask what caused it. If we choose one path over another, we search for the reasons that led us there. This deeply rooted habit of mind is what philosophers call the principle of sufficient reason. Stated simply, it says for everything that is, and for everything that happens, there must be a reason why it is so, and not otherwise. Nothing is simply brute. Nothing stands entirely without ground. Even when we do not know the reason, we assume that one could, in principle, be found. Schopenhauer takes this principle very seriously. In fact, he believes that if we do not understand it, we do not yet understand the structure of the world as it appears to us. The world of representation, as he calls it, is not just a scattered collection of impressions. It is a web of connections. Events follow one another. Thoughts support or contradict each other. Lines meet at certain angles. People act from motives. Wherever we turn in experience, we find not mere isolated facts, but relations of because. Long before Schopenhauer, the German philosopher Leibniz gave a famous formulation of this insight. He wrote that there can be no fact, no true statement, without there being a sufficient reason why it is the case and not otherwise. That sounds almost innocently obvious, yet it has far-reaching consequences, especially when one begins to treat it as a law without limits. From this principle, for example, one can argue that there cannot be two absolutely identical things in the universe. If two leaves were exactly the same in every respect, down to the last detail, what would justify calling one this leaf and the other that leaf? If nothing distinguished them, there would be no sufficient reason why one occupied this place and the other that. The mind, holding fast to the demand for a reason, concludes that some difference must be there, even if we do not see it. Or think of the origin of the universe. If the principle of sufficient reason is extended to everything, without exception, one is tempted to ask, what is the reason that there is a world at all rather than nothing? What explains that this world exists, and exists in this way at this time? For some thinkers, this path led toward a divine creator, a necessary being posited as the final explanation for all contingent things. Schopenhauer is wary of this move. To him, the principle of sufficient reason is not a magical key that unlocks what lies beyond all possible experience. It is, instead, the inner law of our experience itself. It tells us less about things, as they may be in themselves, and more about how our mind must arrange whatever is given to it. The demand for a sufficient reason springs from the structure of our cognition, from the way the subject relates to objects. To see what he means, consider how the principle operates in daily life. An event in the physical world calls for a cause. The window broke because the stone struck it. A belief calls for a justification. I think this claim is true because it follows from these other claims. A geometric truth calls for a proof this triangle has this angle because of its position in space. An action calls for a motive. I did this because I wanted that. In each case, we are not content with bare occurrence. We seek a necessary connection that binds the fact to something else. Schopenhauer emphasizes that this necessity is crucial. If an explanation is genuine, then, once its grounds are in place, what follows could not be otherwise. If the stone hits the glass with such force, the shattering is not a mere accident. If a conclusion follows from valid premises, it does not just happen to be true, it must be true, given those premises. This sense of must is what separates a mere story from an explanation. Because of this, Schopenhauer treats the principle of sufficient reason as a principle of intelligibility. It marks the boundary between the thinkable and the unintelligible. Where no sufficient reason can even be imagined, the mind stumbles. It feels that something has been left hanging in mid-air, unsupported. We might accept that some things will remain unexplained to us in practice, but we resist the thought that they are, in principle, without any ground at all. Yet this very power of the principle tempts us to overreach. When we are used to finding causes for events, motives for actions, proofs for theorems, we easily slip into thinking that everything whatsoever must fall under one single, uniform pattern of explanation. The same idea of because we think must apply everywhere in the same way, from falling stones to moral choices, from logic to love, from the flicker of a candle to the existence of the universe. Schopenhauer's dissertation is, in large part, a careful protest against that assumption. He argues that having a sufficient reason does not mean one single thing. There are different kinds of grounds, different kinds of necessity, and different kinds of objects that stand in need of explanation. We commit serious errors when we ignore these distinctions and mix the styles of explanation together. One of his guiding convictions is simple but profound. Whenever we ask for a reason, we are already standing inside a particular way of seeing the world. We are a subject facing an object inside a form of experience that supplies the very idea of necessity in question. The demand for sufficient reason never arises in a vacuum. It is always the demand of a certain kind of knower, dealing with a certain kind of thing. From this angle, the principle of sufficient reason becomes a path leading us deeper into the structure of our own cognition. Instead of being a ladder that lets us climb out of the world of appearances towards some ultimate metaphysical ground, it traces the patterns within that world itself. It shows how representations hang together, how events, thoughts, numbers, and actions become intelligible to us. This is why, for Schopenhauer, the principle will eventually reveal a fourfold root. The word root is not accidental. It suggests that beneath all the branches of explanation that we see on the surface of experience, there are a few fundamental forms that nourish them. By following the demand for reasons down to these roots, he hopes to clarify what different kinds of understanding are possible for us and what lies beyond their reach. The first step in this clarification is to recognize a basic, unavoidable split at the heart of all, knowledge, the distinction between subject and object. Only when this line is drawn can the idea of a sufficient reason even arise, for it is always the subject who asks why, and always an object whose being or occurrence calls for an answer. In the next stage of this journey, Schopenhauer turns to that distinction and asks what it means that every world we can explain is, at the most basic level, a world appearing to someone. Part 2. The subject-object distinction. Sometimes when you sit quietly and notice your own experience, a simple pattern begins to emerge. There is, on one side, the felt sense of I am here. On the other, there are the things that appear the room, the sounds, the passing thoughts, even the feeling of your own body. However tangled or emotional your inner life becomes, this basic divide silently remains. There is the one who experiences and the things that are experienced. Schopenhauer places this distinction at the very foundation of his philosophy. He sees it not as a theory that could be proven or disproven, but as a condition that every possible theory presupposes. To doubt it, one would already have to take it for granted. For any doubt, any question, any thought at all, is an act of a subject directed towards some object. We are used to thinking of the world as a vast collection of objects, stars, animals, numbers, institutions, memories. We forget that this world is always given in a perspective. It appears to someone. The tables and trees, the flows of traffic and time, are never bare things in themselves. They are objects for a subject. That subject may be you, right now, listening. It may be another animal, another human being, another center of awareness. But without such a center, the word object would lose its meaning. For Schopenhauer, this simple fact has a profound consequence. The entire world, as we know, it is a world of representation. It is the world as object for a subject. Everything we can describe, analyze, or explain is already within this framework. And the subject itself, as knowing subject, is never something that can be turned into an object in the same full sense. We can, of course, think about ourselves. We can remember our past, anticipate our future, describe our character, study our own brain. In doing so, we make aspects of ourselves into objects. But the pure I that does, the knowing is always left over, still on this side of the divide. It is like an I that can see everything in front of it, but cannot turn around to see itself as just another thing among things. This is what Schopenhauer takes over in his own way from Kant. Kant had spoken of a transcendental subject and a transcendental object, highly abstract terms for the formal roles of knower and known. Stripped of all particular content, Schopenhauer keeps the heart of this idea, but translates it back into more direct language. There is, he says, the subject which is the condition of all appearing, and there are the objects which appear in space, in time, and under the law of sufficient reason. Now the link with the principle of sufficient reason becomes clearer. The demand for a reason, for a ground, belongs entirely on the side of objects. It is the way the subject organizes what appears to it. One object stands as the explanation of another. One event accounts for a second. One judgment supports or contradicts another. But the subject itself does not stand in this network. It does not appear as one more node in the chain of because. This is why Schopenhauer can say that the most general root of the principle of sufficient reason is the subject-object distinction. Before we can speak of causes, proofs, motives, or mathematical grounds, there must first be an appearing world and a point of view from which it appears. Only within that scene does the question why make sense. The consequences of this are subtle but far-reaching. Consider the temptation to expand the principle of sufficient reason beyond the world of appearance, to treat it as a law of reality in itself. One then asks, what is the sufficient reason of the world as a whole? What explains the existence of all objects together, the existence of space, time, and causality themselves? Perhaps one thinks there must be a highest cause, a necessary being, a final reason that lies beyond all that is merely given. But from Schopenhauer's point of view, this move forgets where the principle came from. The very notion of ground and consequence, of cause and effect, belongs only to the scene where objects show up for a subject. To apply it beyond that scene is to use a tool outside the domain in which it has meaning. It is like trying to measure anxiety with a ruler or to weigh a melody on a scale. Remembering the subject-object divide then imposes a limit on what reason can justifiably claim. It reminds us that our most basic forms of understanding are tied to the way appearances are structured for us. When we move beyond that structure and speak of things in themselves, we are stepping into a realm where our usual questions may no longer fit. At the same time, this distinction protects the depth of experience from being flattened into a mere mechanism of external relations. If we looked only at objects, we might picture the world as a cold network of impersonal causes, an immense machine grinding on according to fixed rules. But hidden in that picture, sustaining it at every moment, is the subject who sees, feels, suffers, and asks. Later in his philosophy, Schopenhauer will identify the inner nature of this subject with the will, and he will claim that, in our own willing, we gain a unique access to reality that is not mediated solely by representation. For now, he simply wants us to see that the entire arena in which explanations unfold is bounded on one side by the knower who never appears within it as just another object. Within this arena, however, there is still much to clarify. Not all objects are alike. The stone falling, the triangle inscribed in a circle, the concept of justice, the impulse that leads a person to speak or remain silent, each belongs to a different region of experience, and each demands a different style of explanation. The principle of sufficient reason applies in each case, but it does so in a distinct way. To keep our thinking clear, Schopenhauer proposes a careful map of these regions. He speaks of 4 classes of objects and, correspondingly, 4 forms of sufficient reason. Understanding this fourfold structure is crucial, he believes, if we want to avoid confusing one kind of explanation with another, and especially if we hope to keep philosophy honest about what it can and cannot prove. Part 3. The 4 classes of objects and explanations. Across the varied landscape of our experience, the word because seems to travel easily. The glass broke because the stone hit it. The argument is valid because the conclusion follows from its premises. 2 lines are equal because they can be laid exactly over one another. A person apologizes because they regret what they have done. In each case we are satisfied, in a way, by having a reason. Yet, if we look more carefully, we see that these reasons are not of one single kind. Schopenhauer's central move in his dissertation is to sort this apparent unity into a hidden plurality. The principle of sufficient reason, he argues, does not name one uniform relation, but 4 different modes of necessary connection. Each mode belongs to a different class of objects, a different way the world presents itself to the subject. He develops this idea under the influence of Aristotle's old teaching about the 4 causes, but gives it his own shape. Instead of material, formal, efficient, and final causes, he distinguishes 4 roots of the principle, the ground of becoming, the ground of knowing, the ground of being, and the ground of acting. You do not need to memorize the labels. It is their feel in experience that matters. The first class of objects is the most familiar, the material world extended in space and unfolding in time. Here we encounter things that change, move, collide, grow, decay. In this domain, the question why is answered in terms of cause and effect. The window shattered because the stone struck it with a certain force. The plant wilted because it lacked water. The thunder followed because of the electrical discharge in the clouds. This is the principle of sufficient reason of becoming. Given a cause of a certain kind, an effect of a corresponding kind must follow. The necessity here is physical. Once the relevant conditions are in place, the event could not fail to occur. Schopenhauer agrees with the modern scientific spirit in taking this connection seriously. At the level of representation, nothing in the realm of nature is exempt from causality. The second class of objects is not material things, but abstract concepts and judgments. Here we are no longer watching stones and windows, but dealing with propositions, definitions, and inferences. In this realm, the because takes a different form. A conclusion is true because it follows from its premises. A contradiction is rejected because it violates the law of non-contradiction. A definition clarifies a term because it lays out its essential marks. This is the principle of sufficient reason of knowing. It is the domain of logic. The necessity here is not physical but rational. If all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human, then Socrates is mortal is not a physical outcome but a logical one. To deny it is not to break a law of nature, but to fall into incoherence. The third class of objects consists in what appears, in the pure intuition of space and time lines, surfaces, numbers, geometric figures, numerical relations. When we ask for a reason in this context, we enter the territory of mathematics and geometry. A triangle has angles summing to a straight line because of how it is constructed in space. 2 and 2 make 4 because of how units are combined in time. This is the principle of sufficient reason of being. The necessity here arises from the fixed relations of spatial and temporal order. It is neither causal nor purely logical, but intuitive. We see in thought that given such a construction, such a relation must hold. What explains a geometric truth is not a physical event or a logical convention, but the structure of space and time as forms of our intuition. The fourth class of objects belongs to inner life, acts of will, decisions, bodily movements understood as expressions of character. In this sphere, we ask for reasons in terms of motives. A person gives money because they feel compassion. Another lashes out because they feel humiliated. Someone studies late because they desire success. The explanatory, because here does not point to a pushing and pulling of physical forces alone, but to meanings, goals, and felt values. This is the principle of sufficient reason of acting. The necessity here is motivational. Given a fixed character and a present motive that is felt as stronger than its rivals, the actions, Schopenhauer thinks, must follow. Later, he will build his doctrine of the will on this insight, arguing for a strict determinism in human conduct. But already here he marks this sphere as distinct. It is not the same as mere mechanical causation, even though bodily events accompany our actions. With these four classes in view, Schopenhauer insists on a critical rule. The modes of explanation run in parallel, but must not be confused. Once you choose a kind of object to explain, you have, at the same time, chosen the style of explanation that is appropriate to it. If you are dealing with falling stones and rising flames, you must reason in terms of causes in space and time. If you are dealing with arguments and theories, you must reason in terms of logical grounds. If you are handling triangles and numbers, you must appeal to the structures of space, time, and counting. If you are trying to understand human conduct, you must take motives and character into account. Problems arise when we cross these lines without noticing. One common confusion is to take a purely logical connection and treat it as if it entailed the existence of something in the world. From a definition or a concept, we move straight to claims about reality, as though the necessity of thought could serve as a bridge to the being of things. Schopenhauer sees in this the core mistake of famous arguments for the existence of God, especially those that try to prove a necessary being directly from the concept of such a being. To his mind, this is a misuse of the principle of sufficient reason of knowing. It takes a logical necessity among concepts and treats it as a sufficient ground for asserting something about the world of objects. The reverse confusion is equally dangerous, beginning with physical events and ending with conclusions about moral meanings or metaphysical realities that do not belong to that sphere. To see a lightning strike and then infer from it a direct message about someone's moral character would, for Schopenhauer, be to confuse causal explanation with motivational or ethical interpretation. By laying down this set of boundaries, Schopenhauer is not trying to impoverish our understanding. He is trying to protect it from self-deception. When we know clearly what kind of because we are dealing with, we avoid building grand systems on equivocations. We stop ourselves from smuggling conclusions into our premises by silently shifting from one order of explanation to another. This clarity also prepares the way for his larger philosophy. The fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason charts the entire territory of the world as representation. It shows the different ways in which objects appear to a subject and become intelligible. Within this realm, everything has its ground. Every event, thought, spatial relation, and action is woven into one of these networks of necessity. But beyond this realm, the question why may lose its usual force. When Schopenhauer later turns to the will as the inner nature of the world, he will say that it is not bound by the forms of space, time, and causality. It does not appear as one more object, and so it does not stand in need of a sufficient reason in the sense analyzed here. In that way, his early work on explanation already gestures toward a limit it cannot itself overstep. For now, though, it is enough to see how rich our ordinary demand for reasons really is. Under the simple word, because lie four different kinds of necessity, four ways in which the world hangs together in thought. To recognize them is to see the architecture of our own understanding more clearly, and to prepare ourselves for the deeper questions that Schopenhauer will soon ask about what, if anything, lies behind this world that appears. Part 4. Critique of the Kantian thing in itself. Far beneath the technical dispute between philosophers lies a very simple worry. When we say, there must be something behind what we see, what exactly are we talking about? And how do we claim to know anything about it at all? Kant had offered a powerful picture. The world that appears to us in space and time, ordered by causality, is the world of phenomena. Behind it, he said, there is something that exists in itself, whether or not we perceive it. He called this the thing in itself, or nomen. It is not an object we could ever see, touch, or describe, but he thought we must at least affirm that it is there. For Schopenhauer, this is both the great strength and the great confusion of Kant's philosophy. The strength is the clear distinction between how the world appears and what it is in itself. The confusion lies in how Kant talks about that hidden side. As soon as Kant tries to say why there must be a thing in itself, he reaches for a familiar tool, causality. The argument, put simply, goes like this: we are given sensations. These sensations, Kant suggests, must have a cause that is not itself a sensation. There must be something outside our experience that produces the content of our experience. That something is the thing in itself acting on our senses. At first glance, this sounds reasonable, almost inevitable. But Schopenhauer, following earlier critics of Kant, asks us to slow down. What does it mean to say that something outside all possible experience causes our experience? How can we apply the concept of cause and effect to something that, by definition, can never appear to us at all? Causality, for Schopenhauer, belongs to the structure of our representation of the world. It is one of the basic ways in which the mind organizes what is given. To say that one event causes another is to describe a connection between two appearances, two items within the field of possible experience. The flame is seen, the warmth is felt, and we speak of the flame causing the warmth. But as soon as we try to push this concept beyond all experience, it begins to break apart. To claim that an utterly unknowable thing in itself causes our sensations is, in Schopenhauer's eyes, to misuse the concept of causality. It is like trying to paint with a colour that only exists inside the painting itself, and then insisting that the canvas behind the paint must also be that colour. So his first critique is methodological. If we respect the limits that Kant himself placed on the categories of the understanding, we cannot then smuggle those same categories outside the field of experience to prove the existence of a thing in itself. We can speculate about what lies beyond, but we cannot claim it as something we know in the same way that we know causes and effects in the world of appearances. Still, Schopenhauer does not reject the distinction between appearance and reality. In fact, he builds his entire philosophy upon it. What he rejects is this idea of a mind-independent object, lurking somewhere out there, that we infer as a hidden cause. For him, the thing in itself is not an object behind other objects. It is not a hidden domino that knocks down the row of appearances. Instead, he asks us to look in a different direction. If we are to speak of what the world is in itself, perhaps we should not begin with an abstract inference. Perhaps we should begin with the one place where we have more than a merely external view, our own inner life. When I look at my hand, I see it as an object among objects, extended in space, subject to physical laws. But I also experience something else. When I decide to move my hand, I am aware of an inner activity that is not given as an image in space. I feel willing. I feel effort, intention, striving. Here Schopenhauer thinks is a hint of that deeper side of reality. Rather than saying, some unknown object out there causes my sensations, he proposes another thought. The very same event appears from the outside as bodily movement appears from the inside as an act of willing. Two aspects, one reality. Like the two faces of a coin, neither side causes the other. They are simply the same thing seen from different perspectives. This is his replacement for Kant's thing, in itself as a theoretical posit. Instead of a shadowy cause beyond experience, he identifies the reality behind appearances with something we encounter directly, though not as an object. He calls it will, not the personal will of deliberate choice, but a more fundamental, restless drive that we find in our own striving, our own desires and aversions. Once this move is made, Kant's notion of an unknowable X outside our experience loses its function. We do not need to infer a hidden cause of sensations. We already have immediate access to the inner side of at least one appearance, our own body, and that gives us a clue to what the inner reality of all things might be like. Schopenhauer's criticism of Kant's thing in itself is, therefore, not just a technical correction. It reshapes the whole project. Instead of standing at the edge of experience and pointing into a dark void, he turns inward and says here, in this felt willing, is the key. The thing in itself is not a cold, neutral substrate. It is dynamic, striving, restless. It is will. From this vantage point, the world of representation becomes the way will objectifies itself to knowledge. Space-time and causality are still forms of our mind, as Kant insisted. They still belong to the way. The world appears to us as subjects. But the reality that shows itself through them is not a mute, indifferent thing. It is something we recognize from within. This is also why Schopenhauer is less interested in building a complete table of categories, as Kant had done. For his purposes, it is enough to note that the most important structure of experience is the relation of ground and consequent, or reason and what follows from it. Wherever we look in the realm of representation, events call for explanations. We ask, why did this happen? And search for its ground, whether in physical causes, logical reasons, mathematical proofs, or motives for action. He calls this wide-reaching requirement the principle of sufficient reason. It governs our entire life as knowing beings. Yet, crucially, it never delivers the thing in itself. It only organizes the realm of appearances. If we mistake this constant demand for explanation as a bridge to the absolute, we end up where Kant tempted to talk about a hidden object as the cause of phenomena while simultaneously denying that we can know it. Schopenhauer's critique, then, is also a gesture of clarity. Let us be strict, he says. The principle of sufficient reason, the categories, space and time, all of these belong to the world as representation. They are the way the world shows up for us. To reach beyond that level, we must not stretch these concepts past their breaking point. We must instead recognize another kind of access, one that is not mediated by the forms of outer sense. That access is inner experience. My body, as I perceive it, is representation. My willing, as I live it, is not. Between the two, there is no causal gap to be bridged. They are two descriptions of one and the same reality. Here, and not in abstract inference, we encounter something that is not just appearance. By grounding the thing in itself in this immediate awareness of will, Schopenhauer thinks he has both honored and corrected Kant. He preserves the depth of the distinction between appearance and reality while avoiding the contradiction of talking about a completely unknowable object as if we somehow knew its causal role. What remains is a more austere picture, a world of representations, structured by our forms of knowing, and a single dark inner essence given to each of us as our own striving. In the next step of his thought, he will widen this insight. What if the same inner reality that I feel as my will is at work in everything that appears? What if the whole world as representation is the self-presentation of this one, ceaseless, indifferent striving? Then the critique of Kant's thing in itself becomes the doorway to a very different metaphysics, a world that is, at its core, will and nothing besides. Part 5. The world as representation. From within our everyday experience, the world looks obvious. There are things spread out in space, events unfolding in time, causes producing effects. We wake, we work, we move through rooms and streets. It all seems simply there. Schopenhauer invites us to take a step back and notice a quiet but decisive fact. None of this ever appears without a subject. There is always a point of view from which the world is given. There is always someone who sees, feels, thinks, remembers. If we abstract away this living centre of experience, the whole scene of the world as we know it vanishes. To capture this, he says the world is my representation. That does not mean that the world is a private fantasy. It means that whatever counts as world for me is unavoidably something that appears in consciousness, structured by the forms through which I perceive and think. Think for a moment of looking at a distant tree. You experience it as over there, occupying a location in space, separated from you by measurable distance. You also experience it as existing now in a particular moment of time. If you watch the wind move its branches, you experience a sequence of changes, each following another according to familiar patterns. All of this, the there, the now, the because, belongs not to the bare thing in itself, but to the way your mind orders what is given. Space-time and causality are not, in Schopenhauer's view, properties of things that we passively record. They are the lenses through which anything can appear to us at all. Without space, nothing would be outside or beside anything else. Without time, nothing would be earlier or later. Without causality or some form of the principle of sufficient reason, nothing would call for an explanation. Nothing would be connected as ground and consequence. So, when he says the world as representation, he is naming this entire field subject and object together, bound by the forms of perception and thought. There is no object without a subject to whom it appears. There is no subject without some object present to it, even if only in memory or imagination. One way to picture this is to think of a stage. The objects of experience, tables, trees, planets, bodies, are like actors moving across the scene. Space is the stage on which they are arranged. Time is the steady unfolding of the play. Causality is the web of interactions, the way one event follows from another. But the existence of the play itself also requires an audience. Without a spectator, the performance does not become a world experienced. Subject and object, spectator and scene, arise together. Schopenhauer's insistence on representation is not a denial of reality, but a way of marking its two sides. On the one hand, there is this ordered, law governs scene, the world of science and daily life. On the other hand, he believes there is a deeper inner essence that does not show up as an object among objects. His philosophy begins by carefully separating these layers so that they will not be confused. Within the world as representation, the principle of sufficient reason reigns. Every event stands in a network of grounds. A physical occurrence has a cause. A true judgment has a justification. A mathematical truth has a proof. An action has a motive. Our minds are restless here. We constantly move from one thing to another, asking why, and rarely content until we find some sufficient reason that supports what we think or see. Schopenhauer analyzes this in more detail in his early work, but for our purposes, what matters is the overall picture. Representation is never simply given, it is always already organized, placed, explained, or at least explainable. To live in the world as representation is to live within this web of relations and reasons. Notice how much of your day is taken up by this. You see a message and ask what caused it, what it means, how it fits into your plans. You hear a sound and immediately situate it. Upstairs, outside an engine, a voice. You feel a sensation in your body and interpret it as hunger, fatigue, anxiety. In each case, the raw appearance is almost instantly placed into a pattern of space, time, and causal or logical connection. This is the mind's constant work. For Schopenhauer, this constant organization is not optional. It is the very form of our cognitive life. To be a subject of knowledge is to project a world ordered in space, time, and sufficient reason. This is why he says that the world of experience is, in a sense, our own construction, not that we invent its content, but that we supply its form. He often compares this to a dream. In a dream, the mind generates a whole field of appearances that, while we are dreaming, seem utterly real and solid. The dreamer is also the world builder. When we awaken, we recognize that those forms were our own production. For Schopenhauer, waking life is similar in at least one respect. The forms of space, time, and causality are supplied by us, even if the underlying reality that appears through them is not. In this way, the world as representation is both intimate and alien. Intimate because its structure is our own. Alien because within that structure, things confront us as independent objects with their own powers and tendencies. We navigate among them, plan around them, suffer from them, and often forget that the whole field is conditioned by the way we, as subjects, must experience. This is why he places such emphasis on the subject-object distinction. Subject is that which knows, never known. Object is that which is known, never knowing, at least in its role as appearance. The subject cannot become an object within its own field of view without losing its essential character as the irreducible point from which the world is represented. This is another way of saying that we never step outside our own mode of encountering reality. We are always on the side of the subject, even when we talk about ourselves as objects. When you think of your own body as a thing among things, you are viewing it under the aspect of representation, a shape occupying a position subject to gravity, aging, illness. But you are also, at every moment, living that body from within. You feel tension, impulse, resistance. Here we begin to sense the limit of the world as representation and the hint of something more. Yet Schopenhauer does not rush past this level. For him, the world as representation is not to be escaped in contempt, but understood in its full clarity. It is the necessary foreground of our existence. It is where we suffer, pursue projects, fall into conflict. It is also where, in rare moments, we can experience a different relation to things, when, for example, we contemplate a work of art without desire, or lose ourselves in a landscape and the usual demands of willing temporarily fall silent. Those later possibilities depend on seeing first how thoroughly our ordinary world is a construction of representation, and how tightly willing and representation are entwined. Our desires colour what appears. Our fears highlight certain objects and obscure others. The world of representation is never merely a neutral picture. It is suffused with the pressures of the will that lives within us. To say the world is my representation is, then, not a simple slogan of subjectivism. It is a description of the stage upon which the drama of will unfold. Every conflict, every satisfaction and disappointment, every moment of aesthetic stillness or moral awakening will take place within this structured field of subject and object. Soon Schopenhauer will ask a further question. If representation is the way things appear to a subject, what is reality when it is not appearing? What is this inner side that does not show up in space and time, but nevertheless is present to us more intimately than anything we see? His answer begins with the one object that stands at the crossing point of inner and outer the body. In exploring the identity of body and will, he will turn the world of representation inside out, revealing the restless energy he believes drives everything we experience. Part 6. The Identity of Body and Will. Another way to approach Schopenhauer is to start with something very concrete. You raise your arm. You decide to speak. You shift your posture on a chair. These are simple acts, so familiar that we rarely pause over them. Yet in these small movements, he finds the key to his entire metaphysics. Consider what is going on when you move your hand. From the outside, an observer sees a bodily event. Muscles contract, joints rotate, the hand changes position in space. A physiologist can describe this as a chain of causes and effects, electrical impulses in nerves, chemical exchanges in cells, forces transmitted through tissue. It is one more process in the physical world. But from the inside, your experience is very different. You do not first witness this whole chain and then infer that your hand is moving. You feel something like an inner impulse, an intention, a willing. You experience an I want to or I will, and at the very same moment, the movement occurs. It is tempting to describe this in causal terms. We might say first there is the act of will inside, then as a result the body moves outside. But Schopenhauer thinks this is already a distortion, already a projection of the principle of sufficient reason into a place where it does not really belong. When we talk this way, we picture the will as one event and the bodily movement as another, linked by a causal relation. We imagine the will pushing the body as if one thing were acting on another. He proposes a different picture. What if these are not two events at all, but two aspects of one event? What if the inner felt willing and the outer visible movement are simply the same reality, grasped in two different ways? When you raise your hand, the inner aspect is your immediate awareness of willing. The outer aspect is the position and movement of your arm in space. There is no gap between them to bridge, no hidden mechanism needed to connect spirit and matter. They are one. This is what Schopenhauer means when he says that the body is the objectification of will. Objectification here does not mean that the will exists first and then later produces a body as its outcome. It means that what appears under the forms of space, time, and causality as a bodily process is the very same thing that is known from within as an act of willing. In this way, the body occupies a unique position in the world of representation. Every other object you perceive is given only from the outside. You see its shape, its motion, maybe you infer its forces and tendencies, but you do not inhabit it. Your own body, however, is double. It is a representation among representations, but it is also the site where you immediately experience the inner side of that representation. From this double knowledge, Schopenhauer draws a daring generalization. If in my own case what appears as body is, in itself, will, why should this identity be limited to me? What if every object in nature, every force, every movement, has an inner aspect akin to what I know as willing? Not that stones or plants consciously decide, as we do, but that the same fundamental striving, the same blind push, is at work in them as in us. This is how he arrives at the thesis that the world is will and representation. Representation is the way the world shows up to a knowing subject, as bodies, forces, causes, laws. Will is what that world is in itself, the inner, non-spatial, non-temporal reality that expresses itself outwardly in all these forms. The identity of body and will in our own case is the bridge that allows him to extend this double aspect view to everything. It is important here not to confuse will with deliberate choice or rational intention. When Schopenhauer speaks of will, he means something much more primitive. It is the sheer tendency to be, to persist, to press forward, to seek satisfaction, to resist destruction. In us, it appears as hunger, fear, desire, sexuality, ambition, the urge to move, and to change our surroundings. It is often not guided by clear thought. Thought for him usually comes afterward as a servant that helps the will to find its objects more efficiently. Notice how many of your own actions fit this pattern. You feel restless and pick up your phone without any prior plan. You eat not because you have carefully reasoned your way to a conclusion about nutrition, but because a felt impulse grips you. You become angry and only later justify to yourself why your anger was appropriate. In countless moments, the willing comes first, the explanation follows. For Schopenhauer, this is not a mere psychological detail. It is a clue to the structure of reality. The intellect is secondary derivative. The primary fact is this dark push of will. In our bodies, it speaks loudly in drives, in reflexes, in the way life clings to itself. The body is not a mere machine obeying physical laws. It is will unveiled as extended, visible process. Once we accept this, the sharp divide between inner and outer, mind and matter, begins to soften. The old problem of how a thinking substance could interact with a material substance, one of the central puzzles left by Descartes, loses its force. There are not two completely different kinds of being that must be stitched together. There is one reality which from inside is will, and from outside is body or nature. The identity of body and will also reshapes how we view our own individuality. As long as we think of ourselves primarily as individual bodies among other bodies, we are caught within the principle of individuation. This body here, that body there, separated in space and time, competing for resources, colliding, clashing. Within that perspective, conflict is natural, even inevitable. Each individual strives to preserve and expand itself, often at the expense of others. But if we remember that the inner essence of all these individuals is one and the same will, the boundaries begin to look less absolute. The same inner striving that I feel in my own body is, in a different form and degree, present in every other being. This is the metaphysical foundation of Schopenhauer's later ethics of compassion. When I recognize myself in the suffering of another, I am not merely projecting. I am intuiting, however obscurely, that what lives in me lives in them. At the same time, this identity has a darker consequence. If the world of bodies is the self-objectification of a single, restless will, then all the collisions, all the struggles of nature are the will contending with itself. The devouring, the predation, the endless competition are not conflicts between utterly separate substances, but the inner strife of one reality. The battlefield of nature is the will, turned against itself in the mirror of representation. Schopenhauer describes this with stark images: the animal that lives by devouring others, the plant that struggles for light, even the inorganic forces that oppose and limit each other. In each case, the body is the site where the will's striving crystallizes into a particular form. That form persists only by repelling other forms, by appropriating matter and energy, by drawing boundaries and defending them. Your own body is no exception. It maintains itself by taking in food, by expelling what threatens it, by healing wounds, by resisting death for as long as it can. On the surface, this is a biological process. On the deeper level Schopenhauer emphasizes, it is the will in you refusing to let go, insisting on its own continued existence, even though it has no final aim or resting point beyond this blind continuation. This is why the identity of body and will is so central to his pessimism. As long as we exist as embodied individuals, we are embodiments of this ceaseless striving. Our desires arise from our bodily nature. They press forward one after another. When one is satisfied, another quickly takes its place. The body never grants us lasting rest, because the will that shines through it knows no fulfillment, only temporary reliefs and recurring needs. Yet the same insight that reveals this predicament also hints at a way beyond it. If the body is the objectification of will, and if we can, to some extent, loosen our identification with our own will to live, then perhaps we can also loosen the grip that the body has on our consciousness. In rare moments, through aesthetic contemplation, through compassion, through ascetic practices, Schopenhauer thinks it is possible to experience the world and even our own body in a different light. In aesthetic experience, for example, we do not relate to our body primarily as a bundle of needs. For a moment, we become pure subject of knowing. We simply see without wanting. The body is still there, but its urgencies recede. The will, in that interval, is quieted. In compassion, we feel the pain of another, as if it were our own, and in doing so weaken the illusion that our individual body is the absolute center of reality. All of these later themes can be traced back to this apparently simple observation, that the movement of my body and the act of my will are not two, but one. In recognizing their identity, Schopenhauer thinks we have, in miniature, the key to the relation between appearance and reality, representation and will. Our own body is the place where the world's inner nature touches us most directly. To sit with this thought is to feel both its weight and its openness. On one side, it means that as long as we live as embodied beings, we are inseparable from the restless striving of the will. On the other side, it means that we have a unique access to that inner reality. We are not sealed off from what the world is in itself. We are instances of it looking back at itself. From here, Schopenhauer will go on to chart the vast landscape that unfolds from this identity, the blind metaphysical will that underlies everything, the fragmented world of conflict that appears when it is seen through the principle of individuation, and the rare paths through which consciousness can rise above its own willing. But at the origin of all, this stands a very intimate fact. This body I call mine is not just something I have. It is what my willing looks like when it becomes a world. Part 7. The Metaphysics of the Blind Will. In tracing Schopenhauer's thought down to its root, we reach a point where many philosophers would have stopped. They would have taken reason, or spirit, or some luminous principle of order as ultimate. Schopenhauer does something more unsettling. He looks within, takes seriously the inner feeling of drive and craving, and says this, not thought, is what the world is made of. We have already seen how he begins from a simple but profound fact. Your body is given to you in two ways. On the one hand, it is an object among objects. You can look at your hand as though it belonged to someone else. You can watch your movements in a mirror. You can see your body measured, weighed, scanned. On the other hand, you live your body from within. You feel hunger, tension, the surge of anger, the pull of desire. You do not infer these from observation. You are them. For Schopenhauer, this double access is the clue. Every movement of the body, he says, is at once a visible event in space and time and an invisible act of willing. Not cause and effect, not decision first and movement later. One single reality appearing in two ways. Like the two faces of a coin that can never be separated. The inner side is what he calls will, the outer is what he calls representation. When he generalizes from this, the world changes shape. If one object in the world, your own body, has an inner aspect that is will, might not every other object have something similar? We do not feel the inside of the stone, or the tree, or the animal. Yet we know, from our own case, that what appears outwardly as a body can be the expression of an inward striving. Schopenhauer takes a daring step. He extends this inner-outer relation to everything and concludes in itself, apart from how it appears, reality is will. This will is not your personal will. It is not a set of plans or choices deliberated over in your head. It is a more primitive energy, a constant pushing to be, to persist, to expand. It shows itself in the plant reaching toward the light, in the animal hunting, in the storm crashing through a forest, in the human heart that cannot rest in what it already has. Wherever there is movement, tension, growth, or decay, he sees the signature of this inner drive. The word that most troubles readers is his description of will as blind. By this he does not mean random or chaotic. He means that will, as the inner essence of things, does not contain concepts, arguments, or foresight. It does not know why it strives. It simply strives. Intellect, thinking, predicting, calculating comes later as a tool that the will grows in some of its higher manifestations in order to serve itself better. Our capacity to reason on this picture is like a lantern that the will holds up in the dark, not to leave the cave, but to navigate it more effectively. If this is right, then the apparent order and intelligence of the world does not stem from a cosmic mind that planned everything according to a rational blueprint. The direction is the other way around. The deep layer is an aimless, lawless impulse. Regularity's natural laws, and even moral rules are patterns that arise as this impulse objectifies itself in a world of appearances. They are the way a blind force looks when seen from the outside under the forms of space, time, and causality. There is, in Schopenhauer's vision, no benevolent providence guiding events to a harmonious end, no final reconciliation in which every tear is justified. The world as will does not move toward a goal, it merely continues, like a wheel spinning without destination. When we try to imagine it in human terms, the best metaphor he finds is that of a restless, dissatisfied being, forever stretching toward something that can never finally satisfy it. But even this is only a picture. Strictly speaking, the will is beyond personality, beyond the categories of good and evil, beyond any moral story. Yet he also insists that this metaphysical picture is not a cold abstraction. We encounter the will first and most vividly in ourselves, in the inability to rest, in the way one fulfilled desire gives way to another and another, as if our life were a corridor of doors we keep opening, never arriving in a final room. When desire is blocked, there is suffering. When it is satisfied, there is a brief silence, soon filled again by boredom or fresh longing. For Schopenhauer, this cycle is not a local problem we might fix with better institutions or more rational plans. It is the way the will necessarily lives itself, out as long as we are its individual embodiments. To show how far-reaching this is, he combines his metaphysics of will with his theory of representation. Time, space, and causality, he argues, are forms of our perception and understanding. They divide what is, in itself, a kind of underlying unity into separate things spread out beside one another and following after one another. Before the world is filtered through these lenses, there are no distinct individuals, no, you, and me. No this creature and that one. There is only the will, indivisible. Once the world is represented, however, that unity appears as a multitude. The one will becomes, in appearance, countless separate beings, each with its own interests, each striving to preserve itself against the rest. In this way, individuality is born from a kind of optical illusion. It is as if a single, continuous line were seen through a cracked mirror and now appears as scattered fragments. Each fragment fights for its own continuity, unaware that, at the deepest level, it is made of the same stroke. From here, the violence and competition of nature gain a new meaning. When we see one animal devour another, when we watch forests competing for light, when we notice how human projects collide, we usually describe this as a struggle between distinct entities. Schopenhauer says it is the will turned against itself, the same striving that animates predator and prey, victor and victim, has fractured into opposed individuals and now wounds its own body. His image of the bulldog, ant that, cut in half, continues to fight itself to the death, is meant to crystallize this thought. If this sounds bleak, he would answer that it is simply honest. To say that the world in itself is will is to say that conflict and suffering are not accidents on the surface of an otherwise tranquil sea. They are expressions of the fundamental character of reality as long as that reality appears in the form of individuals. Our usual religious or optimistic philosophies, he argues, reverse this relation. They assume that goodness and harmony are basic, and that evil and pain demand special explanation. His metaphysics inverts the burden of proof. It is peace and happiness that are fragile exceptions, temporary reliefs in a field of tension. Still, even this severe picture is not the last word. For Schopenhauer, metaphysics is not written to depress us, but to transform our orientation. If we truly grasp that what acts in us is the same as what acts in all, that the inner essence of the world is this one blind will, two possibilities open. One is deep pessimism, the recognition that striving will never bring the final satisfaction we unconsciously expect from it. The other is a quiet loosening of attachment. If the game is unwinnable on its own terms, we may begin to ask whether we must keep playing at full intensity. Seen in this light, his talk of the blind will is not a mere theory about the universe. It is an invitation to self-knowledge. To observe, in the smallest details of your own day, how often you are moved by forces you do not command. How often actions you call free choices are, on closer reflection, eruptions of temperament, habit, or deep-seated desire. The metaphysics is written in grand language, but its real field of operation is your own inner life. As we move on, this picture will gain further structure. The will, he says, does not descend directly from metaphysical darkness into our everyday world. It first objectifies itself in timeless patterns that Plato once called ideas, and only then is scattered by time and space into individual things. To understand how our restless world of change hangs from this deeper layer, we turn next to these strange, shining intermediaries, the Platonic ideas as the immediate objectifications of the will. Part 8. Platonic ideas as immediate objectifications. Beyond ordinary perception, Schopenhauer asks us to imagine another way in which the world can appear, not as a bustling collection of separate things, but as a set of enduring patterns that shine through them. To introduce this level, he reaches back to one of philosophy's oldest images, Plato's realm of ideas. In Plato's thought, the changing world around us is only a shadow play of something more stable. Individual horses are born and die, but hoarseness endures. Particular acts of courage fade into history, but the form of courage itself remains. These stable patterns, which he calls ideas or forms, are not private concepts in our heads. They are objective structures that the many particular things only imperfectly copy. Schopenhauer takes over this vocabulary, but he places it inside his own metaphysics. For him, the world appears on three levels. At the deepest lies the will, unified and outside all representation. At the highest, most familiar level lies the world of individual objects in space and time. This is the level of daily experience and science. In between these two, he locates the Platonic ideas, the first or immediate objectifications of the will. They are its most direct appearance, before it is scattered into innumerable particulars. To see what this means, consider looking at a single tree. In everyday life, you see this tree here, rooted in this soil, occupying this patch of space, enduring through this sequence of seasons. Its life is linked to causes and affects the quality of the ground, the amount of light, the conditions of the air. This is the tree as an individual phenomenon, subject to time, space, and causality. It belongs to the world as representation in the usual sense. But there is another way you might perceive it. If for a moment the practical interests that usually drive your attention fall away, you might find yourself simply contemplating the treeness of the tree, no longer asking how long it will live, whether it can be used as lumber, or what it signifies in your plans. You see instead the essence of this kind of life, the quiet upward push, the branching form, the way matter arranges itself into trunk, limbs, and leaves. According to Schopenhauer, in this rare mode of perception you are no longer directed toward the individual, but toward its Platonic idea. The Platonic idea of the tree is not located anywhere in space. It does not come into being or pass away. It is, in his language, timeless and spaceless, and so it lies beyond the principle of sufficient reason that organizes the world of change. Each idea is one, though there are many different ideas. There is the idea of the oak, the lion, the human being, the mountain range, and so on. Within each idea there is no plurality. The many individual oaks that grow and fall are only fleeting realizations of a single archetype that never itself enters the stream of becoming. This is why Schopenhauer calls ideas the immediate objectification of the will. At this level, the will is already no longer pure, undifferentiated striving. It has taken on form, it has ceased to be a nameless energy, and has become patterned. Yet it has not yet been broken into particular objects that stand in causal relations and fight for their own finite existence. The ideas are the will as form without individuation, the will as essence before it becomes a multitude. When the human mind applies its full apparatus, when it brings time, space, and causality to bear through the principle of sufficient reason, these ideas are further multiplied into the everyday world. The single idea of the lion becomes thousands of distinct lions, each with a specific location, history, and fate. The idea of the human form becomes a vast population of individual persons, each with a biography. What science studies are primarily these individuated phenomena and the causal laws that bind them. What metaphysics and art seek, in their own ways, are the ideas that stand behind them. Here the connection with aesthetics becomes crucial. Schopenhauer thinks that our usual perception is governed by the will's practical interests. We see the world in terms of what we want or fear. This object can be used, that one can harm, this person is an obstacle, that one a means to our ends. In such a state we see only individuals, because individuals are what the hungry will must navigate among. But if, for a while, the pressure of desire recedes in deep aesthetic contemplation, we can become pure subjects of knowing, as he puts it, and our gaze can rest on the ideas themselves. This is, for him, the secret of great art. The artist does not merely copy particular objects. They reveal the universal pattern that speaks through them. A tragic playwright does not only record the misfortune of one household, they bring to light the idea of human suffering, guilt, and fate. A sculptor does not only carve a single body, they disclose a timeless configuration of strength, grace, or vulnerability. A landscape painter does not only depict these rocks and this water, they present the idea of ruggedness, serenity, or desolation. In every case, the artwork offers us a window onto the immediate objectifications of the will. To contemplate an idea is, therefore, to stand at a certain distance from the turmoil of the will's blind striving, without yet leaving the world of appearance altogether. You are still a subject facing an object, and so you are still in the realm of representation. But the kind of representation has changed. Instead of seeing the world filtered through your individual needs, you see it in its universality. You are no longer one hungry being among many, but a clear eye in which the will's own essence appears. Schopenhauer's revival of Plato is not antiquarian nostalgia. It gives his metaphysics a layered subtlety. Without the ideas, the jump from the dark, formless will to the complex, law-governed world of experience would be too abrupt. With them, we can say the will first shapes itself into abiding forms. These are then reflected under the subject-object framework and the forms of time and space as the shifting multiplicity we inhabit. The ideas are the still images behind the film of the world. This middle realm also prepares our understanding for what follows. If the ideas are outside time and space, then time and space themselves cannot belong to the ultimate nature of things. They must be bound to our way of seeing. The will in itself does not come before the ideas in time, nor do the ideas precede individual things as earlier events. These are only metaphors we use from within our temporal viewpoint. To clarify this dependence of temporal and spatial order on our representation, we now turn to one of Schopenhauer's most challenging claims, that time and space, as we experience them, are not features of reality in itself, but forms of appearance, a kind of shared illusion we can never quite step outside, yet can learn to recognize. Part 9. The illusion of time and space. Amid shifting days and nights, it seems obvious that time is flowing. We are born, we age, we move toward death. Objects appear, endure for a while, and disappear. Space, too, appears unquestionable. Things stand beside one another. Here is my body, over there is the chair, beyond that the wall. The world feels like an immense container, laid out in 3 dimensions, and stretched along a single, unidirectional river of time. Schopenhauer asks us to pause and examine this feeling, not to deny that we experience space and time, but to inquire what kind of reality they truly have. Following and radicalizing Kant, he argues that time and space are not properties of the world as it is in itself. They are forms through which the world must appear to a finite subject like us. They belong, in other words, to the side of representation, not to the side of will. Think of a pair of tinted glasses. Whatever you look at through them will appear coloured by their lenses. The colour is in your way of seeing, not in the object alone. For Schopenhauer, something similar is true of temporal and spatial structure. Every object that appears to us appears somewhere and somewhen. But this, where and when, are contributed by our mode of intuition. They are the way our mind makes sense of what, in itself, is not already laid out in a gigantic grid. This does not mean that time and space are arbitrary fantasies. They are necessary conditions of our experience. We cannot simply take the glasses off. A world without temporal succession or spatial extension is not just hard to imagine, it is, for Schopenhauer, unimaginable for a subject like us. The illusion here is not that we see what is not there, but that we mistake the form of our seeing for the structure of reality as such. Once we grant this, several of his central claims fall into place. We saw earlier that he understands individuality as the result of a kind of metaphysical prism. The one will, in itself undivided, is refracted by time and space into countless separate beings. These beings are then further connected and explained by causality, another form of our understanding. Together time, space, and causality form the core of what he calls the principle of sufficient reason, the demand that everything be explainable by reference to something else. Under this principle, we ask, where is this? When did that happen? What caused it? How will it affect something else? The world of science, technology, and ordinary life is built out of answers to such questions. It is a world of locations, sequences, and chains of events. But for Schopenhauer, this whole articulated order floats, as it were, on the surface of a deeper reality that is not ordered in this way. The will does not stand in front of or behind its manifestations. It is present in each, wholly, without needing to be divided among them. Consider the sense in which, from our point of view, the past is gone and the future is not yet. Our fears and regrets arise from this structure. We feel torn between what cannot be changed and what cannot be controlled. Yet, if time belongs to our form of representation, then this tragic division does not exist in the same way at the level of the will. There Schopenhauer suggests there is something like an eternal now, not stretched out as a line of before and after, but present in a way our language struggles to express. A similar shift applies to space. We are attached to our particular position, enclosed within this body, located at this point among many. Distance becomes a measure of separation and exclusion. Others exist over there with their own joys and pains that, from our egoistic standpoint, seem secondary to what happens here. Yet if space is a form of appearance, then the apparent gulf between centres of experience is not written into the heart of reality. The will does not occupy one spot rather than another. It lives equally in all beings, though, in representation, it seems parcelled out among them. This is why Schopenhauer sometimes compares life to a dream, not that it is unreal in the sense of a hallucination, but that its entire framework depends on the standpoint of the dreamer. Within the dream, events follow one another with necessity, places are distinct and stable, actions bring consequences. Only when we awake do we recognize that the whole order was a construction of the mind. For him, we never fully wake up from the dream of the world, but philosophy allows us to glimpse that we are dreaming. The ethical consequences of this are far-reaching. If the principle of individuation, the sense of being a separate entity, located in a particular place and time, is grounded in the forms of space and time, then our strong attachment to I here now is tied to an illusion. The ego that protects its own future and dismisses the suffering of others as less real is taking the forms of representation as ultimate. Compassion, in contrast, arises when this hold loosens, when we feel that what is essential in us is not confined to this point in space, this brief span of years. Yet we should resist the temptation to treat the illusion of time and space as a simple mistake that can be overcome once and for all. For Schopenhauer, these forms are as inescapable as they are misleading. We must navigate the world of appearances as long as we live. We plan, remember, and act within a temporal order. We move, work, and speak within a spatial one. The point of his doctrine is not to make us ignore these structures, but to prevent us from absolutizing them. When we remember that time and space belong to appearance, we can hold our projects and fears more lightly. We can see the frantic rush to secure a particular future as, in part, the will's own delusion about itself. We can recognize, behind the many competing individuals that fill the stage of history, the single striving essence that objectifies itself in them all, and we can prepare for his later claim that true peace, whether through aesthetic contemplation, compassion, or ascetic renunciation, involves, in some measure, a loosening of our bondage to these forms. With this in mind, the world that surrounds us shifts subtly. The flow of time and the spread of space do not vanish, but they cease to be the last word. They become the shimmering surface of a deeper, timeless reality. On that surface, the will's objectifications struggle and suffer, each in its appointed place and hour. Beneath it, there is only the undivided striving that is the world in itself. Our next step will be to examine how, once fragmented by these forms, nature becomes a universal field of conflict, and how this conflict shapes Schopenhauer's dark vision of existence. Part 10. The universal conflict in nature. Underlying every quiet landscape, Schopenhauer hears a low, unending struggle. A field at sunset may seem peaceful, yet for him, this calm surface hides a deeper drama. The will, broken into countless individuals, pushes against itself on every level of reality. Once this blind striving appears as separate things, conflict becomes unavoidable. To be an individual is to have boundaries, and to have boundaries is to collide. Every creature must hold a place, claim matter, and resist decay. Existence itself becomes a kind of continual combat, where each entity fends off rivals in a ceaseless struggle for survival. Consider a forest. To our everyday eye, it is serene. To Schopenhauer's metaphysical eye, it is a scene of ceaseless contest for resources. Roots push against roots for water. Branches block other branches from the light. Insects consume leaves, and birds prey on insects. Even the soil is a battleground of organisms feeding, decomposing, and replacing one another in an endless cycle of competition and renewal. Nothing here is evil in a moral sense. That is not his point. There is simply the will striving to persist and expand in each form, thereby setting each form against the others. Every plant, animal, and organism expresses the same inner impulse. But as soon as it appears as a distinct thing, it must, as he puts it, feed on others or be fed upon. This is why he is fascinated by images that reveal the will turning against itself in a particularly vivid way. One of his favourites is the bulldog ant. Cut in half, its head and tail, still animated, fight each other to the death. This grotesque image is not an oddity for Schopenhauer. It is an extreme, almost theatrical display of what is happening everywhere, all the time, the same inner nature, fractured into individuals, struggling against itself. We can widen the lens beyond biology. Even mountains and rivers bear the marks of conflict, holding shape only by resisting gravity and erosion. The river carves into rock, wearing it down grain by grain. Planets pull on one another. Stars burn their fuel in slow resistance to collapse. What physics describes as forces in equilibrium, Schopenhauer interprets as a frozen struggle, a temporary balance in a field of opposing pressures. Our human world is not an exception, but a refinement of this basic pattern. The will does not stop striving when it becomes conscious of itself in us. It only becomes more articulate. Hunger becomes economic competition. Territoriality becomes politics and war. The impulse for recognition plays out in our daily lives. The old expression, a war of, all against all, captures this atmosphere, and Schopenhauer takes it almost literally to describe human interactions. Every job gained is a job another did not get. Every promotion, victory and status, or possession implies outmatched wills behind it. Even cooperation, he thinks, often hides a deeper level of competition. Groups forming, alliances to secure advantage against other groups or individuals. He does not mean that all conscious motives are cruel. We can be kind, generous, and devoted in our personal relationships. But beneath these, the will still seeks continuance and expansion also of our body, family, nation, or projects. Where there is striving, there is friction. Where there is friction, there is the possibility of harm. Conflict is not only external, it passes through each of us internally. Inside a single organism, countless processes compete, cells dividing, resources allocated, systems pushing and pulling in a constant internal struggle. Illness in this light is not an alien invasion, but the will also forces misdirected, growing at the expense of the whole organism. Even in mental life, desires collide. One part of us wants rest, another wants achievement, and another wants escape. We often experience ourselves as a small battlefield of incompatible impulses, constantly pulling us in different directions. Schopenhauer traces this all the way back to the structure of appearance. The will in itself is one, not yet divided. The splitting begins when we, as knowing subjects, impose the forms of space, time, and causality upon it. In these forms, one thing must be here and not there, now and not then. Individuation, as he calls it, is the price of a knowable world. And with individuation comes collision, an unavoidable consequence of distinct existence. There is a paradox here. The same faculties that allow us to understand and navigate the world also cast it into a shape of perpetual contest. We cut reality into units so that we can grasp and manipulate it, but in doing so we also cast the will into rivals, threats and obstacles. Our very capacity for representation, for seeing a world of distinct objects, is also what confronts us with a world of conflict. This is why, for him, no amount of outer reform can fully erase struggle. We may reduce certain brutalities, create laws, soften some edges. Yet as long as beings exist as individuals with needs and drives, they will crowd one another. They will hinder and be hindered. New structures may simply shift where and how the clash appears, never truly eliminating the underlying competition itself. If we look closely at even the most ordered societies, we find the old pattern resurfacing in subtler ways. Competition over attention, over affection, over meaning. Nations avoid open war yet, wage economic and cultural battles continuously. Individuals avoid physical violence, yet engage in more refined forms of domination also through reputation, manipulation, and social exclusion. Schopenhauer also vision can feel harsh, even excessive. But he invites us to test it against experience to see its validity. Stand in a supermarket and reflect on how many lives, plants, animals, labor, and exhaustion stand behind each shelf. Walk through a city and imagine the battles also silent and open also that hold its structures in place. The ease we see often rests on unseen struggle. At the same time, this is not a call to cynicism. For Schopenhauer, recognizing the universal conflict in nature is a step toward honesty. Only from there, he believes, can we begin to understand why suffering is so widespread and why any genuine peace must involve more than external changes. Beneath the routines of daily life, the will presses on, restless and insistent. Each being force, and desire pushes against others and its own limits. Out of this pressure, the characteristic tone of existence, emerges a constant sense of tension, risk, and profound unease. In the next step of his thought, Schopenhauer turns from this universal conflict to its inner register in us. How does this endless contending of the will appear from the inside of a conscious life? For him, the answer is simple and stark. It appears as suffering. Part 11. The Pervasiveness of Suffering. Throughout conscious life, Schopenhauer sees one fact returning with relentless persistence: to exist as a willing being is to be acquainted with suffering. Not occasionally, not as an accident, but as something woven into the very structure of experience itself, fundamental to our being. He begins from an observation so ordinary it is easy to overlook. Desire is felt as lack, a sense of something missing. Whenever we want, we feel that something is absent. The more intensely we want, the more sharply that absence stings. Hunger, loneliness, humiliation, anxiety also, their common core is this sensed gap between what is and what we wish were the case. When that gap closes, when the wish is fulfilled, there is a moment of relief, but it's not positive, overflowing joy. It is more like the easing of a pressure, the silence when a noise stops, the calm when a toothache ends, a temporary respite. For Schopenhauer, most of what we call happiness is of this negative kind, the temporary absence of a previously felt pain. And then, very quickly, something else happens. The satisfaction fades into normalcy. The mind begins to search, and a new lack emerges. The pendulum, as he famously describes it, swings from suffering in the form of desire and frustration to suffering in the form of boredom and emptiness. You can watch this pattern in small things. We anticipate a purchase, a trip, a message from someone important to us. We imagine how different we will feel when it arrives. When the moment finally comes, the sharp tension dissolves, and for a while we rest. But soon the object is simply there. The trip is done, the message has been read. Life returns to its usual tone. And we look ahead again, leaning into the next thing, perpetuating the cycle of longing and temporary relief. For him, this is not a superficial psychological quirk. It is the direct appearance, in consciousness, of the nature of the will itself. The will never reaches a final aim because it has no final aim. It is pure striving, also impulse, without a lasting goal. Each attainment is therefore merely a station, never a terminus. Relief is always provisional, never truly complete or permanent. Suffering also arises from collision with other wills. Every desire meets a world, already filled with countless other desires. We want security, but so do others. We want recognition, but recognition is comparative. We want love, but those we love are pulled by their own needs. In this crossing of lines, disappointment and hurt are constant possibilities, unavoidable outcomes of our interconnected desires and conflicting wills. Even when life looks affluent from the outside, Schopenhauer insists that inner unrest persists, unpacified by material comfort. Wealth does not remove insecurity, it refines it. We begin to fear loss, compare ourselves upward, and protect what we have. Success expands the imagination of what might still be missing. The field of possible frustration grows instead of shrinking with achievement. To deepen his point, he invites us to consider not only our personal frustrations, but the sheer scale of suffering across the world. Illness, aging, and death are unavoidable companions of organic life. Every sentient creature is vulnerable to pain, exhaustion, and injury. Across the planet, beings pursue food and safety while constantly facing hunger and threat in a never-ending struggle. The normal functioning of nature, as he sees it, involves a continuous flow of harm, a cycle of predation and decay. He uses ancient myths to crystallize this sense. Think of Sisyphus, condemned to roll a heavy stone up a hill only to watch it roll back down. Or Tantalus, forever reaching for water that recedes, as soon as it is grasped, always desiring, never truly satisfied. These images are powerful because they exaggerate a pattern we already recognize, the endless repetition of tasks, recurring disappointments. The sense that our efforts never quite secure the peace we hope they will, a perpetual striving without true rest. Modern life provides its own versions, emails and obligations that refill. As soon as they are cleared, debts replaced by new ones. Goals achieved that open up new, higher goals. The promise that, just after this next step, things will settle, repeatedly proves false. Schopenhauer also conclusion is uncompromising. The ordinary assumption that life is meant to be happy and suffering is an unfortunate side effect is reversed. The baseline of existence is unsatisfied striving. Happiness for him is the brief and fragile exception to this rule. He is well aware that this picture collides with the cultural optimism of progress, success, and self-improvement so prevalent today. But he thinks that optimism often survives by refusing to look steadily at the facts, the inevitability of loss and death, at the aging and death of all we care about, at the quiet despair that can inhabit even outwardly comfortable lives. This does not mean, in his view, that individual joys are unreal. Laughter, friendship, beauty, tenderness also, these are deeply genuine. They are precisely what make the world bearable. Yet he reads them as oases in a desert rather than as the basic climate of existence. They are episodes where, for a while, the pressure of the will lessens or forgets itself, offering a brief, precious moment of relief. Suffering for Schopenhauer is intensified in humans because of consciousness. We do not merely feel pain, we anticipate it, remember it, imagine it. Memory keeps past wounds alive, imagination projects possible future harms. Time itself, as we experience it, stretches our vulnerability. We do not only suffer what is present, we suffer what is absent, what is lost, or what is profoundly feared, amplifying our pain. There is also the suffering bound up with meaning. We ask whether our efforts matter, whether our lives add up to something coherent. The will, blind and aimless in itself, does not supply an answer. We try to build stories of purpose around its movements, but these stories are fragile. When they crack also through failure, grief, betrayal, also we experience not just pain, but a more radical kind of disorientation, a loss of foundation. Faced with this, many philosophies have tried to defend the world, to show that everything leads toward a rational or just end. Schopenhauer refuses this defense. He does not see history tending toward harmony, nor nature arranged for our well-being or comfort. He prefers a lucid pessimism to what he regards as comforting illusions, facing reality with unflinching honesty. Yet his pessimism is not simply cold. It has an ethical undercurrent. If life is pervaded by suffering, then each sentient being carries a weight. When we drop the expectation that existence is fundamentally benign, the pain of others stops being a distant abstraction and appears as something immediate and serious. Their frustration, fear, and grief are not anomalies to be brushed aside. They are expressions of the same restless will that throbs in us, connecting all beings through shared struggle. In this way, the recognition of pervasive suffering can soften rather than harden us, fostering empathy and understanding. It dissolves some of the harsh judgments we make about failure or weakness. It pierces the indifference with which we often pass by the struggles of strangers. To see suffering everywhere is also to see, everywhere, a claim on our attention and care, a call for compassion. Still, Schopenhauer knows that mere recognition does not yet free us from the will. We are still inside the movement of desire and disappointment. Still compelled to seek and fear and cling. The question then arises, are there moments or modes of experience in which this constant pressure loosens, even if briefly? He believes there are. One of the most significant and most accessible is the experience of beauty, offering temporary respite. There are times when a landscape, a painting, a piece of music seems to lift us, for a moment, out of our ordinary concerns. We are not calculating, not wanting, not comparing. We are simply seeing, or simply listening, lost in the present moment. It is to this possibility also of stepping back from the restless wheel of willing through ascetic contemplation also that Schopenhauer now turns, and with it to the peculiar figure who can dwell there longer and more deeply than most, the artistic genius. Part 12. Aesthetic Contemplation and the Genius. During certain rare moments, the world seems to stand still, a shaft of light in a quiet room, a tree in winter, traced against a pale sky, a melody that halts our inner monologue mid-sentence. In such moments, something in us lets go. We are not reaching, not calculating. We are simply there, present with what appears. For Schopenhauer, these are not trivial experiences. They reveal a different way that mind can relate to the world. In ordinary life, perception is tightly bound to desire. We look at things in terms of use, threat, advantage. This tool can serve us. That person may hinder or help us. Objects are evaluated as means to our ends or obstacles in the way. Aesthetic contemplation suspends this practical attitude. In it, we attend to a thing not as something to be used, but as something to be seen. We let the object show itself in its form, its structure, its inner pattern. The question, what can I do with this, gives way to what is this in its essence. Schopenhauer links this shift to his idea of Platonic ideas. By this term, he means the timeless patterns that underlie the many fleeting individuals we encounter. There is not just this particular tree at this moment, but the enduring form of treeness that shines through it. There is not just this single human face, but the type of humanity it expresses. In aesthetic perception, we look through the individual to this more universal dimension. Gazing at an old, twisted tree, we do not care about its commercial value, its exact age, or whether it belongs to someone. We see, instead, the very character of growth and endurance inscribed in its shape. Its branches become a pure expression of striving upward toward the light. Its scars become a legible record of storms faced and withstood. At the same time, something happens to the subject of experience. As the object becomes more universal, less tied to practical concerns, we ourselves become less narrowly individual. For a while, we forget our particular worries, desires, and personal story. We become, in his phrase, a pure will, less subject of knowledge. This does not mean that we stop existing or that we merge with some mystical absolute. It is simpler and more immediate. The usual sense of I here, wanting this and fearing that recedes. What remains is a clear, undisturbed awareness in which the object fills consciousness. We are like a perfectly polished mirror, reflecting without distortion, without adding our usual haze of needs and anxieties. Many people touch this state briefly, looking out at the sea, listening to a symphony, becoming absorbed in a novel or a film. Time seems to loosen. Minutes pass without being counted, external noise fades and inner chatter quiets. When we return to ourselves, we sometimes say that we had been, lost in what we were seeing or hearing. For Schopenhauer, this temporary loss of self is not a defect but a gift. It is a small liberation from the tyranny of the will. While we are in this state, the endless push of desire is held at bay. Suffering, which is desire, our constant companion, withdraws. We inhabit a mode of being that is contemplative rather than striving, receptive rather than grasping. Art, in this perspective, is not mere entertainment. It is a crafted invitation into aesthetic contemplation. The artist has, in an unusual degree, the ability to discern and hold on to Platonic ideas. Those underlying forms and essences that flicker through the stream of appearances. Through their work, they present these ideas in a purified, intensified way so that others can perceive them. Think of a portrait that seems to reveal a whole character in a single glance, or a poem that, in a few lines, crystallizes an emotion we have felt but never clearly recognized, or a piece of architecture that embodies a certain dignity or lightness, making space itself feel different as we walk through it. In each case, the artist has perceived a universal in the particular, and then shaped materials so that we can see it too. This capacity Schopenhauer calls genius. The genius is not simply more clever or more technically skilled. What distinguishes them is a profound inclination toward perception rather than action, where most of us quickly pass from seeing to using our "what can I do with this?" The genius lingers in seeing itself. They are drawn again and again into the contemplative state where the will falls silent. Because of this, geniuses often seem, to ordinary eyes, impractical, absent-minded, or ill-suited to everyday life. They may neglect their own interests, forget appointments, struggle with routines. Their attention is magnetized by forms, patterns, and inner meanings rather than by social advantage or personal gain. Out of this sustained contemplation arise works of art. These works are like windows cut into the wall of everyday consciousness. When we stand before them with openness, we are gently led into the same state of seeing from which they were born. The genius, as it were, goes ahead of us into that quieter domain, and then returns with symbolic offerings we can share. Different arts guide us along different paths. Visual arts are painting, sculpture, architecture are present spatial forms that embody ideas, the solidity of stone, the grace of the human body, the tension in a landscape. Literature and poetry unfold character and action in time, allowing us to see more deeply into motives, fates, and the universal patterns of human life. Music for Schopenhauer holds a special, almost privileged place, which he develops later in his work. While painting and poetry reveal the ideas that structure the world of appearances, music, he thinks, reaches even closer to the will itself. It does not depict particular things at all. Instead, it mirrors directly the rhythms of striving and repose, tension and release that underlie our emotional life. In music, we hear the will speaking in a purified, non-conceptual form. Yet even without plunging into his full theory of the arts, the central point remains: aesthetic contemplation is one of the few modes in which we are, however briefly, unbound from the restless movement of desire. It is a foretaste of a deeper stillness that his philosophy will later seek in ethics and asceticism. Still, its very transience is important. We cannot remain permanently in the aesthetic state. The will reasserts itself. We get hungry, distracted, anxious. We return to our projects and concerns. The world of conflict and suffering closes in again. For Schopenhauer, this inevitability keeps art from being a final solution. It is a form of respite and illumination, not a full deliverance. But what it shows us during those intervals is crucial. It reveals that our consciousness is capable of something other than willing. It can simply know without clinging. This discovery changes the way we see both ourselves and others. If in aesthetic experience I can become a pure subject of knowledge, then more may live in me than my private agenda and fears. And if, in contemplating a work of art, I recognize in another our creation, a universal truth about the world, then I am already entering a space where the hard line between my inner life and yours has started to soften. From this softened boundary, Schopenhauer will move, in the next stages of his thought, toward compassion and, eventually, toward a form of renunciation. But it is here, in the calm intensity of aesthetic contemplation and in the strange, solitary vocation of the genius, that we first feel the promise that existence might contain, alongside its suffering, a quieter, more lucid way of being. Part 13. The hierarchy of the fine arts. In tracing the shapes of art through Schopenhauer, our philosophy, you begin to see a kind of quiet ladder rising out of everyday life. Each rung is a way in which the world of striving becomes still, a way in which the blind will reveals its form yet loosens its grip on us. He does not think of the arts as a loose collection of human pastimes. For him, they are ordered. They differ in how directly they show us the inner essence of things, and in how far they can carry us away from our individual cravings and fears. At the base of this hierarchy stand the arts that work with heavy materials and silent forces. Think of architecture. A stone arch, a temple, a towering bridge. For most of us, these are useful structures or impressive landmarks. For Schopenhauer, they are the visible trace of invisible tensions, weight and support, pressure and resistance, gravity held in delicate balance. When you look at a great building with an aesthetic eye, you momentarily forget what it is for. Instead, you see the idea of mass, the play of forces, the way matter strains and yet holds. You are no longer a hurried passer by, seeking shelter or a place to work. You are a pure observer of gravity itself, made visible in stone. Already something has shifted. The will is still present in what you see are the same blind striving that pulls all bodies downward are, but in contemplation you are no longer driven by it. You have stepped back. You watch the world our heaviness instead of being crushed by your own. Higher up are arts that no longer present mere forces, but life. Sculpture for Schopenhauer is the revelation of living form in space. A marble figure captures a human body at rest, in movement, or in the poised tension between the two. The muscles, the posture, the expression on the face, these are not simply anatomical details. They are the visible surface of an inner nature. When you quietly observe a classical statue, the contingencies of an individual life fall away. This is not this particular person on a Tuesday afternoon. It is the human form as such, a distilled expression of strength, vulnerability, youth, age, serenity, or anguish. The sculptor, in Schopenhauer our view, has seen through the individual to the Platonic idea of humanity and has made that idea stand before you in stone. Painting adds yet another dimension. Here light and colour enter, as well as the fleeting moods of the natural world. A landscape, a still life, a face emerging from darkness, where sculpture shows you the solid, lasting structure of a body. Painting can reveal the atmosphere around it, the sadness of a twilight sky, the calm of a quiet room, the unease in a slight turn of the eyes. In gazing at such a work, your own passing concerns may loosen their hold. You are taken up into a wider vision. You no longer see just this tree by this road under this particular weather. You see treeness itself, the fragility of life, the smallness of human projects against the horizon of nature. The painter has purified the image. By selecting, arranging and idealizing, they allow the universal to shine through the particular. As the hierarchy rises, language enters. Poetry and drama no longer work only with shapes, colours and masses, but with concepts, characters and stories. At first sight, this may seem less immediate, more mediated by thought. Yet for Schopenhauer, poetry can cut through the surface of appearances with great force, because it can present not only how the world looks, but how it feels from within. Through a poem, you can inhabit a consciousness that is not your own. You can live for a few minutes inside the fear of a soldier, the tenderness of a parent, the despair of a lover, the resignation of a sage. The poet takes the scattered episodes of experience and draws out their essence, showing you the recurring patterns of human life. Hope and disappointment, ambition and failure, love and loss. Among all forms of poetry, Schopenhauer reserves a special place for tragedy. In tragedy, the will confronts itself in its most painful form. Characters struggle, desire, scheme, and suffer. Often their very strengths entangle them in the net of fate. In watching their downfall, you are not simply entertained by misfortune. If the work has depth, you glimpse the structure of existence itself. The way striving generates conflict, the way happiness is fragile, the way guilt and innocence can become hopelessly intertwined. Curiously, he thinks this is not merely depressing. Tragedy, in revealing the harshness of the will our world, can also loosen its hold. When you see the endless repetition of similar struggles, when you recognize in the hero our fate the pattern of all human lives, your own projects can lose a little of their absolute urgency. A space opens for compassion, for humility, and perhaps for the first stirrings of renunciation. Across this hierarchy, one constant theme runs: in genuine ascetic contemplation, you stop relating to things as means to your purposes. You are no longer asking, "What can I do with this?" or "How does this affect my plans?" You simply see. And in that seeing, the object you contemplate reveals not just itself, but its timeless idea, its place in the wider structure of reality. The painter, the poet, the sculptor, the architect are each, in Schopenhauer our eyes, is a kind of guide. They have lingered in pure perception longer than most people can bear. They have learned to suspend their own willing, to let the world right itself upon their consciousness. Out of that purified vision, they create works that can draw the rest of us, if only for moments, into a similar state. This is why he speaks of the genius with such reverence, not in the modern sense of a clever problem solver, but as a person unusually capable of becoming a clear mirror of the world. In their work, the hierarchy of the fine arts becomes a scale of liberation from heavy stone to living form, from light and colour to story and fate. Each step freeing us a little more from the narrowness of our personal will. Yet for Schopenhauer, all of these arts, for all their power, still address only one side of the fundamental division, the world as representation. They reveal the ideas that structure what appears. They clarify, deepen, and idealize the way reality shows itself to consciousness. There is, however, one art that he believes reaches further, an art that does not merely present images of the world, but echoes the hidden pulse that moves beneath them. To understand why he sets this art apart, we have to leave the gallery, step out of the theatre, and enter a different kind of space entirely. A silent hall slowly filling with sound. Part 14. The Metaphysics of Music. Consider standing in a dim concert hall just before the first note begins. The air is thick with expectation, but nothing has yet happened. No story has been told. No image has appeared. Then out of the silence, a single tone emerges, followed by another and another. Within moments, you find yourself moved, calmed, unsettled, uplifted by something that carries no words and no pictures. This, for Schopenhauer, is the clue that music is not simply one more art among others. He gives music a radically different status. It does not merely imitate the world, nor simply portray emotions or accompany stories. It has its own direct line to the inner structure of reality. To see what he means, remember his basic distinction: the world as representation, filtered through our perception, and the world as will. The will is the blind, ceaseless striving that underlies everything that appears, including yourself. The visual and literary arts deal with the world as representation. They present the Platonic ideas, the timeless patterns that shape trees, mountains, bodies, and characters. Contemplating a great painting, you glimpse these enduring forms. Music, however, does something stranger. It does not show you any particular object at all, nor even a description of an event. Yet, when you listen, you feel that something deeply real is being revealed. Schopenhauer says music is a copy of the will itself. It does not represent individual things or their underlying ideas, but the very movement of willing, striving, and release. He develops this thought with analogies. The lowest bass notes, steady and weighty, correspond to inorganic nature, the sheer existence of matter, the slow pressure of gravity, the basic ground. From this base, more complex harmonies emerge, like higher forms of life arising from simpler structures. The middle voices mirror plants and animals. Richer, more articulated manifestations of the will. Then at the top, the melody unfolds, analogous to the human world, with its hopes, fears, and conflicts. When you follow a melody, you are not following a narrative in the usual sense. Yet it feels as though you are watching a life unfold. There is a beginning, a development, a crisis, a resolution, or sometimes a refusal of resolution. Intervals create tension, returns bring relief, unexpected turns can shock you. For Schopenhauer, this structure is not accidental. It is the will, as it were, speaking its own grammar, purified and stripped of ordinary objects. This is why music can seem so uncannily personal, even without lyrics. A sequence of notes can feel like joy itself, sorrow itself, defiance itself. Not my particular joy, or your specific sorrow, but the bare form of those emotions, lifted out of their circumstances. Something important happens here. Normally your emotions are bound up with your own story. You are sad because of what happened to you, anxious about your future, pleased with your success. The will is always pointing you toward some object, but when you hear sadness in music, you are not necessarily grieving for anything particular. You are experiencing the essence of sadness without its cause. Likewise with joy, longing, resignation, or triumph. You share the will's movement, yet are freed. This double character makes music, in Schopenhauer's vision, both metaphysical and consoling. It lays bare the will's dynamics, without binding you to private desires. In life, you are usually inside the story, pulled back and forth. In music, you are allowed to hover just above it. You still feel the tension and release, but they are no longer entirely yours. You witness the drama of striving and satisfaction as something impersonal. From this vantage point, the endless agitation of the world appears as form, as pattern. Pain and beauty are entwined, longing woven into harmony. The same will that crushes individuals in its blind flood now seems to sing, to articulate itself with grace. Yet music is not mere pleasantness. The pieces Schopenhauer admires, like a slow symphony movement or a grave string quartet, often carry a deep, almost religious seriousness, making suffering audible in a purified way. In doing so, they nudge the listener toward a more contemplative attitude. You sense my pain is one instance of a much larger pattern, one voice in a vast, impersonal chorus of willing and frustration. This realization, while sobering, can also be quietly liberating. It narrows the gap between you and others and weakens the absolute claim of your own desires. Great musicians and composers often share philosophical interests. For Schopenhauer, the most philosophical temperament is a musical one, attuned to structure beneath surface, responsive to inner movement rather than just outer appearance. He imagines a person deeply immersed in music is granted a higher kind of knowledge, not empirical fact, but of how reality pulses and twists. It is a wordless insight resistant to paraphrase. You cannot translate a symphony into a treatise without losing its essence. Its truth is bound to its medium. At the same time, Schopenhauer recognizes a limitation. Music detaches emotions from concrete causes, so it can fail to awaken direct compassion. You may feel sadness in a piece without being moved to alleviate any particular person's suffering. The pain has been abstracted into beauty. This is why, in his overall picture, music is both a summit and a threshold. It offers a powerful experience of transcendence available within life. It allows the will to contemplate itself, and in that self-contemplation to loosen its frenzy. But to pass to moral awareness, something else is needed. A turning of attention from the pure form of suffering to the suffering of this person here and now. Still, music remains unique. as a mode of contact with the metaphysical core of the world. Other arts show us how the will appears. Music lets us hear how it feels from within. In that shared vibration between inner life and outer sound, Schopenhauer locates a serenity that is not simple joy, but a kind of lucid acceptance. When the last note fades and the whole returns to ordinary silence, you step back into the world of clocks, tasks, and causes. Yet the echo may linger. Your own striving can seem a little less absolute, a little more like one line in a vast, intricately woven score. From here, his thought turns in a different, colder direction. If reality is rigid and law-governed, what room is left for freedom? If our actions flow with the same inevitability as notes in a composition, what does it mean to speak of the bondage or the liberation of the will? Part 15. Determinism and the bondage of the will. Elsewhere in Schopenhauer's reflection, the music of the world gives way to a harder, more austere insight, total determinism. If everything that appears is governed by cause and effect, if every event has its sufficient reason, then our actions too unfold with necessity. They follow from what we are and from our circumstances. Schopenhauer takes this further. Determination is total. Given a person's character and motives, only one action is ever really possible. This seems to crush the idea of freedom entirely. We like to think we could have done otherwise, chosen a kinder word, a braver act. Schopenhauer calls this a comforting illusion. When you picture a different choice, he says, you quietly alter the conditions, dreaming up a different you or situation. But in the exact state you were in, same character, motives, background, you could not have acted differently. The act was a necessary expression of who you were. This view paints a stark picture, the world as a vast web of necessity, every thread tied to another, every motion rooted in a prior cause. Your decisions are not exceptions, they are part of it, as tightly bound as a falling stone or an orbiting planet. Yet this doesn't destroy responsibility. Schopenhauer relocates responsibility. You are not free to break the chain of causes, but you are identical with the character from which your actions flow. We feel this in our unshakable certainty that we are the authors of our deeds, experiencing basic ownership over what we do. Even acknowledging countless influences, we feel our actions as expressions of ourselves, not mere happenings that befell us. Schopenhauer distinguishes between our empirical character, patterns of tendencies emerging in behavior, and a deeper, intelligible character. The intelligible character is a timeless act of will that we, in some sense, are. Each deed is a temporal manifestation of this underlying nature, like a leaf expressing its tree's species. On this picture, you are not free to step outside your character at will. In a given situation, you respond as that character must respond. This is the bondage of the will at the level of action. You cannot help but be yourself. Paradoxically, Schopenhauer finds something calming in this recognition. If everything happens necessarily, the frantic wish that the past should be different looks empty. The thought I could have avoided this loses its grip, replaced by a clearer understanding. Given who I was, this could not have gone otherwise. This insight doesn't excuse cruelty or erase guilt. Instead, it reframes them. A cruel act reveals a cruel character. Guilt is another expression of what we are. Understanding this deepens our sense of life's tragedy and softens harsh judgments. It supports a more compassionate view of others. If every person acts out of a character they didn't choose, in circumstances they didn't design, rage gives way to sorrowful comprehension. We see in wrongdoers not free demons, but expressions of the same blind will, trapped. Determinism becomes an ally of moral awareness. It undermines the illusion of radical separateness. My triumphs aren't mine alone. Your failures aren't solely yours. We are all waves of the same dark sea. Knowledge of our character can change how our life is lived, even if the character itself cannot change. We learn to navigate patterns with more grace. The same basic nature acts, but it can act more lucidly, less blindly. He compares this to performing a role on stage. The script is fixed, the character given, but you can play the role clumsily or with insight, restraint, and dignity. In that difference lies a quieter freedom, not from necessity, but freedom in how necessity is lived. Where then is transcendence? For Schopenhauer, it's not a magical power to break the chain. It lies instead in a transformation of our inner stance toward the chain itself. In everyday willing, you are fully invested in particular outcomes. You fight, scheme, and suffer for success, relationships, recognition. The sense that everything depends on your efforts fuels anxiety and struggle. Determinism, seen deeply, erodes this absolutism. It reveals your striving as one necessary movement among countless others. From this recognition, two different paths can open. One is resignation in the shallow, sense a tired shrugging of the shoulders, a passive drifting along. Schopenhauer has no admiration for this. It is merely the will turning against itself in discouragement, without higher insight. The other path is more demanding. It is a kind of contemplative acceptance in which you see the flow of events, including your own actions, as the manifestation of a reality that vastly exceeds you. You continue to act, to work, to respond, but with a loosening of inner clench. You know what must happen will happen, not under personal control. Joined with the ethical realization that the same inner essence lives in all beings, this acceptance can nourish compassion rather than indifference. You see in others' struggles the same bondage you discover in yourself. Their failures and yours, their sorrows and yours, are variations on a shared theme. In this way, the doctrine of determinism, far from being a mere theoretical claim, becomes another way in which Schopenhauer seeks tranquility. Not the tranquility of ignorance, but the quieter air that comes when illusions fall away, of absolute freedom, isolated guilt. Your story at the universe's center. Beyond this, his thought will move toward even more radical possibilities, a partial loosening of the will's grip, a voluntary turning away from desire and satisfaction. But even before that, within the tightly woven fabric of necessity, he finds room for a subtle, reflective liberation, a way of being that acknowledges bondage, and yet, in understanding it, already stands a little apart. Part 16. The Intelligible and Empirical Character. Within Schopenhauer's thought, the question of who we are is not answered by looking at our memories, our social roles, or even our changing moods. These, for him, belong to the surface of life. They are how we appear in time, not what we are in ourselves. To get closer to that deeper layer, he turns to a distinction he borrows and reshapes from Kant, the split between our empirical character and our intelligible character. Empirical character is the self we usually recognize. It is the pattern that shows up in our behavior across situations and over the years. If you observe yourself honestly, you may notice that there is a certain style to the way you react, a typical way you respond to praise, a familiar way you handle conflict, a tendency to be cautious or impulsive or to hover between the two. These regularities are what Schopenhauer calls your empirical character, the character as it appears in experience. But he wants to know what gives this pattern its unity. Why is it your pattern and not another? Why do you return again and again to the same kinds of mistakes, the same kinds of strengths, as if called back by something deeper than conscious choice? To answer this, he introduces the idea of intelligible character. This is not another layer of psychological traits, nor a secret personality test hidden in the soul. Intelligible character is a single, timeless act of will that you, in your inner essence, are. Timeless here does not mean that it lasts a long time. It means that it does not belong to time at all. Time, for Schopenhauer, is part of the world as representation. It's the framework within which events line up as before and after. Intelligible character stands outside that sequence. It is like the musical theme from which a whole symphony unfolds, or the inner form of a tree that is revealed, bit by bit, through seasons of growth. The symphony plays in time, the tree lives and dies in time, but the theme and the inner form, as such, do not. In this sense, each of your actions in the world is an expression of that one inner act. Every decision, every gesture, every word is a particular stroke in which your intelligible character becomes visible. The empirical character is simply this inner act as it appears, scattered through moments, shaped by circumstances, motives, and external constraints. This view has a striking consequence for the old problem of freedom and necessity. At the empirical level, Schopenhauer is a determinist. Within the world of experience, he thinks everything that happens by necessity. Given a certain character and a certain motive, the action that follows is not random. It is fixed, much as the fall of a stone is fixed once you know the forces acting on it. When you look back on your life, you may feel this necessity, the sense that, given who you were then and what was happening, you could not have acted otherwise. He does not see this as a threat to responsibility. Instead, he uses it to dissolve a confusion. We are not free, he says, in the sense of being able to step outside our character, to choose differently as if spinning a wheel. But we are free, in a deeper sense, in that our intelligible character does not come from outside us. It is not imposed by circumstance. It is what we are. When you feel a quiet but unshakable sense that you are the author of your deeds, Schopenhauer takes that seriously. It is not the fantasy of some absolute, unconditioned power of choice. It is the awareness that your actions flow from your own inner essence. You are responsible because in each deed you are expressing yourself, not something alien. The necessity of your behavior, in time, is the necessity with which a melody follows from its theme. This can sound abstract, but it touches a very familiar experience. There are times when we feel that we have acted in a way that was not really ours. Perhaps we gave in to pressure, or fear, or confusion. Later we say, almost in surprise, that was not like me. In Schopenhauer's language, we sense a gap between some accidental disturbance in our empirical life and the more stable line of our intelligible character. Over time, he thinks self-knowledge closes this gap. By observing ourselves with honesty and patience, we learn the contours of our innate tendencies. We see the recurring motives that move us, the situations that draw out our best and worst. In doing so, we are not changing our intelligible character, which is beyond time, but allowing it to appear more clearly and coherently in our empirical life. He sometimes describes this as learning to play, the role we have been given more artistically. Imagine an actor who has been assigned a particular part. The script sets limits. This character is proud, or timid, or tragic. These limits cannot be erased in the middle of the performance. Yet the actor can embody the role clumsily or gracefully, mechanically or with depth. In a similar way, self-knowledge allows us to inhabit our own character with a kind of artistry. We cannot choose a different essence, but we can express it more lucidly. This thought resonated later with Nietzsche's phrase, "Become what you are." It suggests that the work of life is not to reinvent ourselves endlessly as if starting from nothing, but to uncover and to affirm a form already present, not in the sense of resignation to our worst impulses, but in understanding our true capacities, our limits, and the style of existence that genuinely belongs to us. For Schopenhauer, this process of self-clarification has an ethical dimension. As we come to see our actions as necessary expressions of our character, the desperate struggle to be someone else begins to soften. The constant tension of wishing our past had been different loosens slightly. This does not excuse harm, but it reframes it. When you recognize that others, too, act from an inner necessity, blame shifts into understanding. There is space for regret, for responsibility, and also for a kind of tragic compassion toward the human condition. This perspective can also bring a certain tranquility. If everything that happens in the phenomenal world is woven into a web of causes and motives, then the frantic wish to rewind time or to rearrange the past gradually loses its power. You see that events could not have unfolded otherwise than they did, given the totality of conditions. Schopenhauer himself speaks of a calm that comes from accepting this necessity, a release from the constant inner protest against reality. Yet he is careful not to let this drift into indifference. The very same philosophy that frames our lives as necessary expressions of the will also insists that suffering is real and weighty. To understand that a person could not have acted otherwise does not mean that their action does not matter. It means that our response must move beyond simple blame or praise to a deeper awareness of the forces at work. In this way, the doctrine of intelligible and empirical character connects the metaphysics of will to a certain attitude toward oneself and others. It invites a more lucid self-acceptance without self-deception and a more generous view of the faults and failures of others without denying their effects. You begin to see each person as the temporal unfolding of a single inner act, as a particular melody in the great, often dissonant, music of the world. At the same time, the link to music is not accidental. Schopenhauer holds that music reveals the will more directly than any other art. It does not show us particular things. It traces patterns of tension and release, longing and fulfillment, that run beneath the surface of life. In a similar way, intelligible character is like a basic musical line, a fundamental rhythm of willing, which every episode of experience reflects. To live with this awareness is not to look down on life from a cold height. It is to participate fully, but with a certain distance woven into that participation. You know that in each action you are, in some sense, repeating yourself, allowing a deep tendency to manifest once more. You know that others do the same. The result, at its best, is not cynicism, but a calm, almost artistic relation to existence. From here, Schopenhauer's thought turns naturally to the forces that keep us locked into a narrow concern for ourselves, and to the possibility of moving beyond that narrowness. The intelligible character explains how each of us is a distinct expression of the will. The next question is why we so stubbornly experience ourselves as isolated centers, and what it might mean to see through that isolation. Part 17. Egoism and the Principle of Individuation. Deepening our journey into Schopenhauer's ethics, we come now to the force that, in his eyes, holds the world of suffering together: egoism. He does not mean by this a mere love of comfort or the wish to be treated well. Egoism for him is the fundamental stance of taking oneself as the absolute center, of valuing one's own existence above all else, and of seeing others only in terms of their relation to one's own will. To understand why egoism is so powerful, Schopenhauer links it to a basic structure of how the world appears to us. Earlier he described how the principle of sufficient reason organizes our experience. According to this principle, everything that happens must have a reason, a ground, a cause. We grasp the world as a network of events and objects, each explained by something else. This is the basis of science, of practical planning, of everyday understanding. But this way of seeing requires that the world be divided. It presupposes that there are many distinct things separated in space and time, standing in relations of cause and effect. This division he calls the principle of individuation. Through it, the one will that surges beneath appearances is broken up, as it were, into countless individuals, separate bodies, separate stories, separate fates. From within this framework, each person seems like an island. My body is here, yours is there. My pains are directly felt only in this body, while yours appear to me, at first only as external facts. When I hunger, it is my hunger that presses itself on me as urgent. When I am threatened, it is my danger that fills the horizon. The pains and needs of others reach me much more weakly, as if muffled through distance. Egoism, therefore, seems natural. It is the default orientation of a being that experiences itself as a single, vulnerable point in a universe of competing forces. To secure my own well-being, or even my bare survival, I must often pay less attention to the sufferings of others. Their needs appear as obstacles or as resources, tools or threats, not as realities that count in the same immediate way as my own. Schopenhauer does not deny this naturalness. In fact, he emphasizes it. The will, in its blind striving, asserts itself in every living thing. The plant overgrows its neighbour. The animal hunts or flees. Human beings, too, are driven to pursue their desires, even at the expense of others. Egoism is, in this sense, the direct expression of the will at the level of the individual. What he questions is the metaphysical picture that makes this egoism appear as an ultimate truth. The principle of individuation belongs to the world as representation. It is a way the underlying will presents itself to our intellect, but it does not reach the thing in itself. Beneath the apparent plurality of beings, there is, for Schopenhauer, a single undivided reality. Each individual is only a different objectification of the same will. When we forget this, the illusion of absolute separateness hardens. We behave as if our own being were all that truly mattered, and as if others were merely shadows at the edge of our concerns. From this illusion, he thinks, arises the full scale of human injustice, the readiness to harm, to exploit, to ignore, whenever it seems to benefit the self. The structure of causality reinforces this. Just as in science we consider one object acting on another, so in daily life we imagine ourselves as agents, who can simply use other people as means to our ends. Person A does something to person B, and we stop there. We rarely ask whether, at a deeper level, A and B are expressions of one and the same inner essence, confronting itself. In this way, the very cognitive tools that allow us to navigate the world also conceal a more profound unity. They fragment so that we can explain and predict. But they also tempt us to confuse this fragmentation with the final truth. The result is what Schopenhauer calls the natural standpoint, a world of isolated individuals, each protecting and advancing their own will. Egoism, then, is not just a moral failure. It is a metaphysical misunderstanding lived out emotionally and practically. It is what happens when the intellect, formed to serve the will, takes the appearances of separation as absolute and constructs a life around them. In that life, my gain can seem simply opposed to your loss, my joy to your sorrow, as if they belong to different orders of reality. Schopenhauer's critique is not only directed outward. He invites each listener to notice how deeply egoism shapes their own perception. When you are hurt or embarrassed, how quickly does the entire field of awareness contract around that feeling? When you anticipate a pleasure, how strongly does the expectation colour your picture of the future? The pains and joys of others recede. They become sketches, while your own experience feels vividly painted in. Yet from within this egoistic perspective, there are moments of fracture. There are times when the wall between self and other thins, even if only for an instant. Seeing a stranger stumble and injure themselves, you may feel a sharp, involuntary wince, as if their pain had crossed into you. Hearing someone speak of a deep grief, something in you resonates that is not a calculation. These moments, for Schopenhauer, hint at another mode of awareness, one that does not fit neatly within the principle of individuation. Still he insists that egoism remains the rule and compassion the exception, at least in ordinary life. The will clings to its particular embodiment. It tends to affirm itself and to view the world through that affirmation. Even our moral language often hides egoistic motives. We seek reputation, security, the pleasant feeling of seeing ourselves as good. The self still stands at the centre, merely clothed now in more refined desires. The philosophical question is whether we can, even partially, loosen the grip of this standpoint. If individuation belongs only to the realm of appearance, then to recognize this fact is already to take one step back from sheer egoism. We begin to sense that the boundaries we draw so firmly may not be absolute, that the same will that burns in us burns in others, that the same vulnerability runs through all those faces that we quickly categorize as friend or stranger. In Schopenhauer's narrative, this realization grows into a new form of consciousness. It does not erase the phenomenal separations. We still see many bodies, many biographies. We still feel our own pain most immediately. But we also come to know, in a more interior way, that the difference between my suffering and yours is not as deep as it seems. They are pains of the same underlying life. From the standpoint of egoism, this can only appear as a threat. If the barriers between self and other weaken, does that not mean that I must carry more of the world's burden? That my own sphere of care expands painfully. And in a sense, Schopenhauer answers, yes. Moral awareness does increase our sensitivity to the suffering of others, and thus exposes us to more pain. Yet at the same time, it changes our relationship to our own individuality. It loosens the knot of self, importance that makes our personal fate the sole measure of reality. Seen from this higher perspective, egoism begins to look narrow and anxious, like a tight fist in a larger open hand. It is the will grasping at a small piece of the world and calling it I, forgetting that what it clings to is only a single wave on a vast, restless sea. To move beyond egoism is not to deny individuality, but to recognize it as a surface effect, a way that a deeper unity appears. This movement beyond individuation prepares the way for Schopenhauer's central ethical claim. If egoism is rooted in an illusion of separation, then genuine morality must arise from a different source altogether. Not from rules imposed from outside, nor from calculations of advantage, but from a transformed way of seeing others. He names this new standpoint with a simple word: compassion. Part 18. Compassion as the basis of morality. Slowly turning from the critique of egoism, Schopenhauer asks what, if anything, can ground a truly moral way of living. He is unsatisfied with two of the dominant answers of his time. On one side, the rationalist view that morality is founded on pure reason, on universal principles that any thinking being must accept. On the other, the utilitarian idea that right and wrong are a matter of calculating overall pleasure and pain. Both, he thinks, miss something essential. They remain, in subtle ways, within the orbit of egoism. Appeals to rational duty can become abstract, cold, and disconnected from actual suffering. Calculations of utility can easily be bent to favor the interests of the one doing the calculation. What he looks for instead is a motive that, in its very nature, breaks the spell of self-absorption. That motive is compassion. Not pity in the sense of looking down on another, nor mere softness of heart, but a direct, felt participation in the suffering of someone else. When you act from compassion, You are moved because of what the other undergoes, not because of what you stand to gain or lose. For a moment, their pain counts in you as if it were your own. Schopenhauer sees in this experience a metaphysical significance. Remember that, at the level of the will in itself, there is no strict separation between beings. The principle of individuation, with its partitions of space and time, belongs only to the realm of appearance. Beneath it, the same inner reality lives in all. In compassion, this hidden unity glimmers into consciousness. When, for instance, you see someone being humiliated or mistreated and feel in your own body a kind of echo of their shame or fear, something has crossed the boundary. You do not reason your way to the conclusion that their suffering matters. You sense it immediately. The metaphysical identity of your inner nature with theirs expresses itself as a psychological fact. You are struck by their pain as if a wound had opened in you. For Schopenhauer, this is why compassion can serve as the foundation of morality. It is not imposed from outside, but arises from the structure of reality itself, once recognized. It contradicts egoism at its root. Egoism says, only my own well-being has ultimate value. Compassion says, the suffering of this other is, in some sense, also mine. In that collision, the individual will is, for a moment, checked, softened, or redirected. This does not mean that compassionate action always feels pleasant or serene. Often it involves a kind of inner cost, the willingness to endure discomfort, to give up advantage. But precisely in this willingness, the will begins to transcend its fixation on a single embodiment. It loosens its grip on the I and opens to the larger life that pulses through all. Schopenhauer thought that the world's great religious and ethical traditions intuited this. He speaks with respect of Christian charity and of the ethics found in Indian sacred texts. In different languages, they all commend the same gestures treat, others with the same care you accord yourself, refrain from cruelty, do not take revenge, lighten the burden of those who suffer. For him, these are not arbitrary divine commands. They flow from a deep insight into the unity of all willing beings. What distinguishes his approach is that he attempts to explain this unity philosophically without recourse to revelation. The same inner essence that I experience as my will to live, to strive, to avoid pain, also animates others. When I am moved by their distress, I am, in an obscure way, responding to myself as objectified elsewhere. Compassion is thus a kind of self-recognition that has overcome the illusion of separateness. He contrasts this with a merely intellectual acknowledgement. It is one thing to know that others are human beings like you, or rational agents deserving equal respect. It is another thing to feel their inner life from within. Compassion is not an abstract judgment. It is an imaginative entry into another's experience, an almost magical identification in which, for a time, your own individuality is less central. Schopenhauer invites us to consider what this expanded awareness might look like at its highest reach. Moral consciousness, when fully developed, no longer oscillates simply between my private joys and sorrows and those of a few close others. It widens to encompass the vast, mingled story of humanity itself. In that consciousness, the torturer and the victim, the fortunate and the destitute, are seen as different manifestations of the same underlying nature, entangled in a drama that repeats itself across ages. The feeling associated with this, he suggests, is a kind of sublime. There is tranquility because one is no longer wholly imprisoned in the narrow perspective of the individual. Yet there is also something like terror, because one now grasps the extent of suffering in the world. The joys, triumphs, humiliations, and griefs of countless lives all press upon the mind at once, as if one were leafing through a novel that contained within it every possible human story. Art can hint at this state. Think of a painting or sculpture that shows a figure in extreme anguish, yet gives us, the viewer, a strange stillness. As we contemplate it, the suffering is not denied, it is not prettified, but we see it from a vantage that holds together both the pain and a measure of distance. Schopenhauer often returns to such images as examples of how consciousness can embrace the world's torment without immediately being crushed by it. In moral consciousness, something analogous occurs. By recognizing that the boundary between self and other is ultimately illusory, the individual takes onto themselves the suffering of the world. Yet at the same time, the personal will is, to that extent, quieted. Desires rooted in the small circle of me and mine lose some of their urgency. They are seen against the backdrop of a much larger field of existence. This double movement has two aspects. Negatively, compassion and the moral awareness it brings can free us from the restless alternation of craving and boredom that marks ordinary life. When your attention is no longer captured solely by your own disappointments and pleasures, their power to agitate you diminishes. You still feel them, but they are no longer the entire horizon. Positively moral awareness introduces a kind of wisdom. You begin to see recurring patterns, how pride leads to conflict, how fear distorts perception, how longing can both animate and destroy. These patterns are not observed coldly. They are felt from the inside through repeated encounters with the joys and trials of others, and an honest gaze at your own. The result is a more spacious, less reactive presence in the world. For Schopenhauer, such wisdom does not culminate in heroic action or grand reform. He is, in many ways, skeptical about large-scale projects to improve the human condition. Since the will continues to strive and conflict wherever life appears, suffering can never be eradicated within the phenomenal world. Compassion does not promise a utopia. What it does offer is a different stance within an unredeemed reality. The compassionate person refrains from adding unnecessary pain. They treat others not as rivals in a struggle for satisfaction, but as fellow manifestations of the same troubled essence. They are gentle where they might have been harsh, forgiving where they might have pursued revenge, generous where they might have clung to their advantage. This moderation of the will's self-assertion prepares the way for the final steps of Schopenhauer's ethics, which move beyond morality in the usual sense toward asceticism and the denial of the will to live. Compassion is, in his view, the turning point. In it, the will first becomes clearly aware of itself as split against itself, seeing its own inner nature suffer in countless forms. It begins, slowly, to withdraw its demand for life and enjoyment at any cost. Even if one does not follow him all the way to this radical conclusion, the core insight remains striking. Moral life, on this picture, is not primarily about obeying rules or optimizing outcomes. It is about a transformation in how we perceive others and ourselves. The hard line that once separated my suffering from yours softens. Underneath the accidents of birth, class, and character, we discern the same trembling will, the same basic vulnerability to pain and loss. In your own experience, you might notice how such moments of compassion feel. There is often a quiet decentering, a shift from the cramped space of self-preoccupation to a wider, more open field. You care, and that care is not a project of the ego but a movement of something deeper. For Schopenhauer, in that opening, however brief, the world of representation becomes slightly more transparent. Through another's eyes, the one will looks upon itself. And in that self-recognition, the possibility of a quieter, less violent way of being begins to dawn. Part 19. The transition to asceticism. At first it might seem as though compassion is the end of the story. You recognize yourself in others. You feel their suffering as your own, and the harsh edge of egoism softens. In Schopenhauer's path, this is already a deep transformation. The rigid boundary between me and not me starts to blur. And morality takes root in a very simple truth, the inner. Reality in you is the same as the inner reality in them. Yet for Schopenhauer, this is not the final resting place. Compassion, as profound as it is, still belongs to the world of willing. The compassionate person still wants something. They want to help, to relieve, to protect. Their projects are gentler, but they are still projects. The will to live has not disappeared. It has only turned its energy away from selfish aims toward the good of others. From this soil, another possibility begins to grow. It does not arise from indifference or coldness. It begins from a sharpened awareness of just how deep and inescapable suffering runs. The more clearly a person sees the ceaseless striving of all beings, the more they grasp that every satisfaction is fleeting, every pleasure purchased at a cost, every victory balanced by someone else's loss. Schopenhauer imagines a person who contemplates life in this way without turning away. They see the anxious movement of existence, birth and decay, hunger and labour, attraction and disappointment, hope and its collapse. They see that even there, compassionate efforts only touch the surface. They can ease particular pains, but they cannot dissolve the restless machinery itself. Out of this clear and sober vision, a new feeling may arise. Not hatred of the world, and not a passing mood of despair, but a deep weariness with the endless cycle of desire and frustration. It is as though the person slowly withdraws their approval from the whole game of striving. They no longer merely ask, "How can I make this more bearable?" They begin to ask, "Why must there be this constant pressure to begin with?" This is the beginning of the transition to asceticism. The person has not yet denied their will to live, but they are no longer at ease in affirming it. The old goals lose their shine. Ambition, status, romance, possessions, even ordinary comforts start to feel strangely thin. It is as if the light has changed, and what once looked rich and meaningful now appears washed out and fragile. Schopenhauer does not see this shift as a psychological breakdown. He sees it as the result of a moral and metaphysical insight carried to its limit. When you fully understand that the inner essence of the world is blind striving, and that this striving continually produces pain, your relation to willing itself can change. You begin to sense that every new desire is a renewed participation in the very structure that you now recognize as the source of suffering. At this point, renunciation gradually becomes attractive, not as an act of self-hatred, but as a lucid refusal to add more fuel to the fire. The person starts to simplify their life. They give up unnecessary comforts. They loosen their hold on possessions. They stop pursuing new pleasures for their own sake. They may choose celibacy, solitude, or material poverty, not because these are inherently holy, but because they weaken the grip of the will on consciousness. From the outside, this may look like extreme minimalism or a life of voluntary restraint. But for Schopenhauer, its meaning goes deeper. The ascetic is not merely trying to live with less. They are quietly stepping back from the affirmation of existence as a whole. Every desire they let go of is a small refusal, a refusal to say yes to the will that pushes through them and through all of nature. Here Schopenhauer turns toward figures like the Buddha, Christian monastics, and saints such as Saint Francis of Assisi. Across cultures, he finds people who have given up wealth, status, sensual pleasure, and even ordinary family life. They live simply, often in obscurity, usually in quiet. What fascinates him is not their outer lifestyle alone, but the inner orientation that this lifestyle expresses. In their renunciation, he sees an attempt to turn away from the will to live itself. This transition is not gentle in every respect. Schopenhauer is honest about this. The instincts of the body do not easily surrender. Hunger, sexual desire, fear of pain, fear of death, the urge to protect what is mine, all of these remain active. The person who chooses an ascetic path enters into a conflict with their own nature. Their insight pulls them in one direction, their body and habits pull in another. In quieter moments, the ascetic may experience a deep peace. With fewer wants comes fewer worries. With fewer claims on the future comes more space in the present. The absence of constant projects opens a stillness that is difficult to find in a life of incessant plans. But alongside this peace, there is struggle. The will does not volunteer its own extinction. Beneath these psychological descriptions, Schopenhauer sees something more structural. The body, for him, is the visible side of the will. It is the will made flesh, immediately given in sensation and drive. When the ascetic disciplines the body through fasting, celibacy, watchfulness, and simplicity, they are not just performing rituals. They are slowly loosening the bond between consciousness and this embodied will. They begin to experience themselves less as a particular individual with fixed interests, and more as a kind of transparent awareness through which the world passes. Their sense of I becomes thinner, less tightly attached to this one organism and its fate. This continues the work that compassion began. Compassion softened the boundary between self and other. Asceticism now goes further, questioning the value of clinging to any individuated standpoint at all. One way to picture this transition is to imagine standing on a shore at dusk. At first, you are busy with the small details, the sand under your feet, the noise of people talking, the things you plan to do later. Then slowly your attention shifts. You begin to notice the vastness of the sea, the endless motion of its waves. The fact that it has been here long before you and will remain long after. At some point, your personal concerns grow quiet in the face of this immensity. They do not disappear entirely, but they lose their absolute importance. In a similar way, the ascetic in Schopenhauer's sense gradually shifts attention from the urgencies of personal life to the deeper, uneasy rhythm of the will itself. The result is not simple resignation to fate, nor cheerful acceptance. It is something darker, more serious, a refusal, born of understanding. To affirm the will's demand for more life, more striving, more becoming. This is why Schopenhauer speaks of an attitude of denial rather than a single act. There is no magic moment when the will to live simply turns off. There is, instead, a slow training of perception and desire. The person comes to prefer calm over excitement, clarity over intoxication, sufficiency over excess, silence over noise. They move away from any situation that reignites strong craving, strong attachment, strong aversion. And yet this life is not hostile to others. Quite the opposite, because the ascetic has stepped back from personal gain. They are less likely to harm, manipulate, or compete. Their renunciation often expresses itself outwardly as gentleness, patience, and a quiet compassion. That no longer needs to prove itself. They may still help and comfort others, but without the same inner pressure to achieve or to be recognized. In this way, the transition to asceticism forms a bridge between morality and something beyond morality. It arises out of compassion and clarity about suffering. It expresses itself in renunciation, restraint, and simplicity, and it points toward a more radical possibility that Schopenhauer calls the denial of the will to live. A possibility in which the very roots of willing are challenged. At this threshold, the person stands between two worlds. On one side lies the familiar landscape of striving, moderated now by compassion and insight. On the other side lies a more mysterious region in which willing itself begins to fade, and another kind of consciousness slowly appears. To understand this further step, we have to look more closely at what it means to deny the will to live at its core. Part 20. The denial of the will to live. Over time, the ascetic attitude does not merely simplify life. It begins to question the very principle that underlies life as we normally know it. This principle, for Schopenhauer, is the will to live the deep, non-rational drive that pushes every creature to preserve itself, to seek satisfaction, and to reproduce. It is this drive that beats in the heart, hungers in the stomach, longs in desire, and trembles in fear. To deny the will to live, then, is not just to give up particular wishes. It is not merely to renounce wealth, status, or certain pleasures. It is to turn away, as far as possible, from the basic impulse that says, I must continue, I must assert myself, I must secure my happiness here. It is to say a radical no to the metaphysical engine that keeps existence turning. This can easily be misunderstood. It might sound like a sophisticated name for suicide or for a wish to annihilate oneself out of despair. Schopenhauer is very clear that it is not. Suicide, as he sees it, is still an affirmation of the will to live. The person who kills themselves does so because they cannot endure their particular conditions of life, not because they have ceased to desire life as such. They destroy the phenomenon, the body, but not the inner will. The will, he thinks, would simply appear again in other forms. The denial of the will to live is different. The ascetic who has come this far continues to exist in time and space. They continue to eat enough to survive, to sleep, to protect the body from obvious harm. But within, their basic relation to existence has altered. They no longer consent to the will their demands. When new desires arise, they do not eagerly feed them. They watch, they understand, and as far as they are able, they let them pass. Imagine a person who has known both great pleasure and great disappointment. They have chased many forms of satisfaction and found, each time, that the glow fades. Eventually they realize that this pattern is not an accident. It is built into the structure of willing itself. Every fulfilled desire gives way either to boredom or to a new desire. There is no final point at which the will can rest. For the one who denies the will to live, this insight becomes decisive. Instead of treating it as a reason to redouble effort, to find the right object this time, the right partner, the right achievement, they treat it as a reason to step away from the game entirely. What is the point, they think, of endlessly rearranging the pieces if the basic unrest remains the same? This is where the struggle becomes most intense. On the one hand, there is the clarity of knowledge, the understanding that all striving is bound up with suffering. On the other hand, there are the instincts of the body, the pull of pleasure, the fear of pain, the urge to survive. Schopenhauer describes this as a battle between the universal, self-awakened through insight and compassion, and the individual self, rooted in the body and its drives. He does not romanticize this battle. It is, in his words and imagery, a kind of inner crucifixion. The person feels both the pressure of desire and the firm resolve not to obey it. They experience something like what mystics in many traditions call the dark night of the soul, a period in which the old sources of comfort and motivation no longer work, but the deeper peace has not yet fully arrived. From one angle, this looks like will against will. A higher or more universal willing the will confronts the lower, more immediate forms of desire. This creates a paradox. If everything, including the ascetic's deepest resolve, is an expression of will, then how can will turn against itself and overcome itself? Does not any attempt to deny the will to live simply become another act of willing, another form of striving, wrapped in religious or philosophical language? Schopenhauer acknowledges this tension. He sometimes explains it by saying that a more universal manifestation of will overpowers a more particular one. The will of the whole, recognized in its futility, suppresses the will of the individual that still clings to life and pleasure. It is as if the ocean, recognizing the disturbance of one turbulent wave, gently smooths it back into calm. Yet he also recognizes that this explanation still uses the language of conflict. It still pictures will as setting itself against itself. This is part of what makes this stage so dramatic and so difficult. The ascetic, at the brink of the denial of the will to live, is engaged in the most extreme of all struggles. A struggle not against the world outside, but against their own nature at its roots. Practically, this denial expresses itself in familiar ascetic disciplines, poverty, chastity, fasting, solitude, silence. These are not ends in themselves. They are tools for weakening precisely those attachments through which the will to live most powerfully works, the attachment to bodily comfort, to sexual reproduction, to social recognition, to distraction, to control. But there is another, subtler form of denial happening as well. The will to live does not only seek food, security, and pleasure. It also seeks knowledge, but often with a hidden purpose to control, predict, exploit, and manipulate. We constantly apply the principle of sufficient reason seeking causes, functions, and purposes. This is not only because we are curious, but because we want to know how to use things for our ends. For Schopenhauer, the ascetic must loosen this habit too. They must step back from the restless drive to understand everything in terms of why and what for. This does not mean sinking into ignorance. It means that knowledge is no longer in the service of projects. The world is seen, but not constantly pressed into the framework of advantage, fear, and utility. When this happens, something remarkable follows. The usual field of conflict in which evil appears begins to dissolve. Evil, in Schopenhauer's sense, arises wherever the individual will asserts itself at the expense of others, under the spell of individuation and competition. If the individuated standpoint itself weakens, if the ascetic no longer experiences themselves primarily as this one, separate centre of striving, then the whole scene of rivalry starts to fade. This is why he can say, a bit poetically, that the ascetic consciousness resolves the problem of evil. It does not fix history or undo past harms. It does not rearrange the world. Rather, by withdrawing the individuated will from the stage, it removes the very structure of perception in which the world appears as a battlefield of conflicting interests. In mythic language, Schopenhauer compares this to returning Adam and Eve to paradise. In the biblical story, the fall begins with the desire for knowledge. The wish to know good and evil, to stand apart from the whole as a judging subject, corresponds to the birth of the individuated, objectifying consciousness. This consciousness sees a world of separate things to be used, feared, or desired. The ascetic's denial of the will to live reverses this movement. They loosen both the practical will that grasps and the cognitive will that divides. They no longer cling to the perspective that says, I here over against that there. In doing so, they symbolically undo the first separation, the primal stepping out from unity into conflict. From the everyday point of view, this looks like nothingness. To a person still immersed in striving, a life without strong desires and plans seems empty, colourless, almost dead. If there is no ambition, no romantic passion, no attachment to possessions or reputation, what remains? It is tempting to describe this state as a kind of self-erasure. Schopenhauer does not completely resist that description. He admits that, in terms of the will, to live, the goal is indeed a kind of self-erasure. The individual form of willing, with its particular projects and cravings, is allowed to fade away. But he also insists that from within this process, another experience opens up. It is not the blunt nothingness of mere absence. It has, he thinks, its own quiet content. The difficulty is that our language is almost entirely shaped by the world of willing. We have words for striving, success, failure, gain, loss, fear, hope. We have far fewer words for a consciousness that is simply present. This consciousness is without pushing or pulling, without affirming or rejecting. For this reason, Schopenhauer often speaks of the denial of the will, to live in negative terms. He can say clearly what is being let go of. He struggles to say what positively appears when the will falls silent. Still he offers images calm, serenity, unshakable peace. A mystical quiet in which the individual self and its anxieties dissolve. At the farthest point of this process, knowledge remains, but willing does not. It is like a mirror that reflects, but does not lean toward what it reflects. This marks the edge of what he can describe within his own system. Beyond that edge, he hints, something even more mysterious may lie, a state that can no longer be captured as subject, knowing object, or as will blindly striving. This deeper possibility leads him into his most enigmatic discussions, those of mysticism, and the ocean, like peace that he believes, stands at the horizon of ascetic denial. In silence, after the fiercest inner struggles have passed, Schopenhauer imagines a different kind of consciousness appearing. It does not surge forward with projects. It does not recoil in fear or cling in desire. It does not even look out at a world as something standing over against it. Instead, there is a still awareness, without pressure, without demand, without the restless mark of the will to live. To describe this, he reaches for images more than for arguments. He speaks of an ocean like calmness, a tranquility in which the storms of desire have finally spent themselves. From the side of ordinary life, this state looks like nothing at all. No goals, no ambitions, no dramatic feelings, no stories of success or failure. Yet from within, he suggests it feels like a boundless peace. He draws comparisons to Buddhist notions of prajna, paramita, the perfection of wisdom. He also draws comparisons to mystical language found in Christian and other religious traditions. Words like ecstasy, rapture, illumination, and union with God circle around this experience. None of them quite capture it. They are approximate names for something that, by its very nature, outstrips the concepts shaped by our usual striving minds. Up to this point in his philosophy, Schopenhauer has worked with a threefold structure. There is the world as representation, the world of space, time, and causality, where subjects perceive objects and events unfold in chains of reasons and effects. There is the world as will, the inner, blind striving that underlies all phenomena. And there is the level of timeless patterns, or Platonic ideas, which art allows us to glimpse behind the shifting appearances of the everyday world. Mystical consciousness, however, does not fit neatly into this scheme. It cannot belong to the world of representation because in this state, Schopenhauer says, the fundamental forms of subject and object fall away. There is no longer an I standing here and a world over there. There is no experienced time stretching from past to future. There is no felt space in which things are laid out, but neither can it be simply identified with will as thing in itself. In his basic picture, the will is blind, without knowledge, endlessly striving without rest or satisfaction. Mystical consciousness, in contrast, contains knowledge. Indeed, a form of knowing more direct and immediate than anything found in ordinary cognition. It also carries a sense of profound fulfillment, an end of striving. A stillness that is the opposite of the will's perpetual unrest. If it is neither a normal object of representation, nor the blind will, nor merely a vision of Platonic ideas, then where does it belong? Schopenhauer's system strains under this question. He is tempted to say that, from the standpoint of ordinary life, mystical consciousness simply is nothing. No will, no representation, no world. But he also sees that this cannot be the whole story, because for the ascetic who experiences it, it is not experienced as blankness. Instead, it is experienced as a positive, luminous peace. To navigate this tension, he makes a quiet but important adjustment. He begins to say that the thing in itself, the ultimate reality behind appearances, is will only for us as we ordinarily are. For beings whose inner life is dominated by striving, the deepest accessible aspect of reality shows itself as will. Yet he suggests the thing in itself may have other dimensions, other modes of being that we normally cannot grasp. Mystical consciousness, on this view, is a rare access to one of those other dimensions. When the will to live has been denied, when individual striving has subsided, then another face of the thing in itself becomes faintly visible. From the perspective of the still, willing subject, this appears as a kind of nothingness. There is nothing there that desire could latch onto, nothing to gain or lose. But from within itself, it is not an absolute void. It is a relative nothingness only when measured by the standards of a world built on craving. This is why Schopenhauer sometimes sounds very close to certain mystical or pantheistic traditions. The world as will and representation is no longer the whole. It is a manifestation, a mode of expression, of something deeper and more many-sided. That deeper reality includes the restless play of the world, but is not exhausted by it. In the quiet of mystical experience, it is as if consciousness sinks back into that wider ground. The image of an ocean can help here. In everyday life, we are like waves rising and falling, each with a particular shape, height, and trajectory. We identify with this wave its brief story, its collisions, its crash on the shore. The will, as Schopenhauer describes it, is the energy driving these waves, never at rest, never finished. In asceticism, the wave gradually ceases to throw itself forward. In mystical consciousness, the wave no longer experiences itself as a separate crest at all. It is only the ocean still, boundless, quietly present. From the outside, we may be tempted to turn this into a doctrine about what really exists beyond the world. Schopenhauer resists that temptation. He insists on the limits of conceptual knowledge. We can say, perhaps, that in this state there is no fear, no craving, no isolation. We can say that it is a peace that passes understanding. But as soon as we try to define it more precisely, we are forced back into the language of distinction, opposition, and purpose. The very language that belongs to the world we are trying to look beyond. Still, he does not dismiss this experience as an illusion. On the contrary, he treats it as the final confirmation of the path he has traced from seeing the world as representation to recognizing it as will, to loosening the grip of that will through aesthetics, morality, and ascetic renunciation, mystical consciousness is the far horizon of this path, the point at which the last trace of willing falls silent, and yet awareness does not sink into simple non-being. If we ask what ethical meaning this has, the answer is subtle. Schopenhauer does not present mystical peace as a reward for good behavior, nor as a state that everyone is called to reach. He is careful not to turn it into a duty or a general prescription. Most human lives, he thinks, will remain bound to the world of striving, with occasional respites in art, compassion, or quieter living. Yet the very possibility of this oceanic peace changes the way we can view our own existence. It suggests that our being is not fully contained in the restless self that plans, fears, and desires. When even for a moment we find ourselves in a stillness, without urgent want, perhaps in deep contemplation, in grief that opens into clarity. Or in a silence beyond words, we may be touching, in a very small way, the edge of what he calls mystical consciousness. This does not mean we have become saints or fully denied the will to live. It means only that in the cracks of our ordinary life, we glimpse that when desire quiets, we do not vanish. Something remains a bare, spacious awareness that does not immediately rush to claim, defend, or interpret. Schopenhauer would say that in such moments the world as representation thins, and the tie to will loosens, if only slightly. He is honest, though, about how rare the full form of this state is. The permanent oceanic calm he describes belongs, in his view, only to a handful of ascetic mystics. These mystics are scattered across cultures and centuries. For most of us, the path will be partial and incomplete. We may move a little way along it through art, through compassion, through modest renunciation. We will likely move back again into the currents of everyday life. Even so, his picture invites reflection, if the root of our suffering lies in ceaseless willing. And if there is at least a hint of consciousness beyond willing, then our relation to desire can change. We may not be ready or even willing to deny the will to live, but we can begin to notice when desire tightens its grip, when the future pulls us out of the present, when the need to control and possess turns the world into a field of conflict. In those moments, the memory of another possibility may act as a quiet counterweight. We can experiment with small acts of letting, goad a deliberate pause before chasing a new want. A simpler response to an old fear, a compassionate step back from competition. Each of these, however modest, is a tiny movement away from blind striving and toward a more spacious awareness. At the farthest edge of his philosophy, then, Schopenhauer does not leave us only with pessimism. He does not promise happiness in the ordinary sense, nor deny the pervasive reality of suffering. But he points, almost reluctantly, to a horizon where the storm of existence opens into an ocean of peace. We cannot chart this ocean with clear maps. We cannot possess it as a concept. We can only move slowly and honestly in the direction of less willing and greater clarity, and listen for the faint sound of a deeper stillness beneath the noise of the world.